Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where the ancient world slows down, mystery meets comfort, and history drifts gently into the kind of story that keeps you listening, even as your eyes begin to grow heavy. Tonight's quiet journey takes us far beyond the written page, into a time when kings were not merely men, and history itself was still deciding whether to begin. It's a story about a ruler who may have been the last of his kind, a being said to have reigned before the rise of empires, before the counting of years, before even the memory of humankind was fully its own. His name has been found in fragments, on tablets so old that the clay itself seems to hum with the weight of forgotten memory. They call him the Last Anunnaki King. Before we wander too deep into those ancient shadows, I wonder, where are you listening from tonight? Are you in the quiet hum of a city that never quite sleeps? Or somewhere far from lights, where the stars still feel like they might be watching back? Either way, it's nice to have your company for this slow unravelling of something both vast and deeply human. And if you find comfort in this calm exploration of the strange corners of history, I'd be grateful if you gave the video a like or subscribed. It helps this little corner of stillness reach others who might need it too. So, settle in, breathe a little slower, and let's begin. Because somewhere in the space between myth and archaeology, between what was written and what was whispered, there waits a story of a king who outlived time itself. The legend begins, as so many do, in the dust of Mesopotamia. The rivers Tigris and Euphrates, winding like twin veins through the land of Sumer, carried more than water. They carried memory. Somewhere around 12 or 13,000 years ago, long before the cities of Ur and Uruk rose, long before the tablets of kings began to record reigns and wars, the old gods of the sky were said to walk the earth. They were not worshipped as distant beings then, but as rulers, teachers, and sometimes even family. Among them was a line of leaders whose reigns stretched for thousands of years each, so long that the very concept of time seems to bend under their stories. The Sumerians later wrote about them as the Anunnaki, those who descended from heaven. They were said to have governed the world before the flood, when the stars themselves marked the boundaries of empires. One of these rulers, according to the most curious of the ancient king lists, was the last to hold the throne before everything changed. His reign, the tablets say, lasted over 13,000 years, a number that almost feels like a mistake until you realise that the Sumerians were not exaggerating for drama. They were recording what they believed to be literal truth, passed down from those who remembered an older world. What does it mean, though, for someone to rule for that long? Perhaps it wasn't meant to describe human years as we know them. Maybe those ages were symbols, meant to express something beyond counting, an age of divine order, of perfect knowledge, when the boundaries between gods and men had not yet hardened. The last Anunnaki king, whoever he was, seems to have stood at the edge of that fading order, watching the slow unravelling of a world built by beings no longer entirely at home on Earth. Archaeologists, of course, read these tablets differently. To them, the names and numbers are myths stitched onto clay by scribes thousands of years after the events they describe. They see metaphor in the vast lifespans, not evidence. Yet even among scholars, there's a kind of quiet unease about how these early records fit together. Why do so many ancient cultures speak of a time before the flood, of rulers who came from the sky, of sudden knowledge and then of loss? It's not proof of anything beyond storytelling, but it does make one pause. The last of those kings, called sometimes Ziusudra, sometimes Atrahasis, sometimes even Alulim's heir, was said to have ruled in a place that no longer exists on any map. Its name was Agade, or sometimes Eridu, depending on the source, but it was always described as the first city, the prototype of civilization, the place where heaven met earth. There, in palaces said to shimmer like sunlight on water, the Anunnaki kings governed not just people, but the balance of nature itself. The crops, the floods, the stars and the seasons all answer to them. And then, something changed. The stories do not say exactly what. Some say the gods quarrelled among themselves. Others speak of humans growing restless, demanding the knowledge of the heavens for themselves. In one version, the great ruler defied the will of the higher gods and opened the gates of wisdom to mankind, an act that forever divided heaven and earth. The punishment, if you can call it that, was time itself. The age of eternal rule ended. The world would now belong to mortals, finite, brief, and forgetful. Imagine that moment, if it happened. A world in transition, where beings who had lived for millennia began to fade and humans began to rise in their place. For the last Anunnaki king, that must have been both awe and sorrow. A closing of one age and the uncertain birth of another. Perhaps he understood it better than anyone. Maybe that's why he stayed as long as he did, holding back the floodwaters of change, trying to preserve what could not be preserved. The flood came anyway. It's strange how universal that memory is. Nearly every ancient culture, from Sumer to India, from the Bible to Mesoamerica, speaks of a great deluge that reset the world. The Sumerian version is among the oldest. In it, the gods, weary of human noise and rebellion, decide to wash the world clean. But one man, Ziusudra, is warned and builds a great vessel to survive the waters. When the floods recede, he steps out into a changed world, one ruled no longer by the immortals but by men. Some believe Ziusudra was the last Anunnaki king himself, spared to preserve memory, but stripped of eternity. Others say he was human, chosen by the gods to inherit their place. Either way, his survival marked the turning of the age. After that, everything became smaller. Lifespans shortened, knowledge fragmented, cities rose, fell, and rose again, each claiming to rediscover the wisdom of the ancients. And somewhere, buried beneath the layers of time and silt, the story of that last great ruler waited, half remembered, half erased. It's easy to dismiss all this as myth, but myths have a strange persistence. They don't vanish even when their gods do. They linger in language, in architecture, in symbols carved where few now think to look. Take the step pyramids, the ziggurats that rise from ancient Sumer to distant Mesoamerica. Each was built as a stairway between heaven and earth. The same idea, repeated across oceans and ages. Coincidence maybe, but perhaps also a shared echo from that older world, the world of the Anunnaki kings. The last of them, according to later stories, did not die as mortals do. He simply withdrew, into the mountains or beneath the earth, or perhaps even back to the stars. In one Babylonian fragment there's mention of a great light that rose from the sea, carrying away the remnants of the divine court. Another tablet describes a house of wisdom, hidden before the flood, a place where the secrets of the heavens were sealed away until mankind was ready to find them again. Thousands of years later, when archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Sumer, they found traces that seemed almost deliberately arranged, as if someone had wanted to leave a message, but in a language that could only be understood by those who remembered how to listen. Cylinders and seals showing winged figures tending to trees that aren't quite trees, stars arranged in unfamiliar constellations, and kings offering gifts to beings whose proportions hint at something not entirely human. Of course, none of this proves that the last Anunnaki king was real in the way we think of reality. But then again, not all truth survive as facts. Some survive as patterns, as habits of thought, as quiet questions that keep resurfacing whenever we look too closely at the past. Every now and then, a new discovery stirs the dust. In 1901, in what is now Iraq, a fragment of a very old tablet was uncovered. It mentioned a ruler named Amenluanna, whose reign was said to have lasted 43,200 years. For decades, scholars debated whether he was myth or metaphor. But among the same collection were other names, some once considered fictional, now confirmed as historical. Cities once thought imaginary had turned out to be real, buried under layers of sediment and salt. so the debate never quite ends. If such kings did exist, even as symbols of an earlier epoch, they would represent something extraordinary, a link between a pre-cataclysmic civilization and the one we call the cradle of history. The idea unsettles and fascinates in equal measure, because it suggests that history, as we know it, might be just the second or third draft of the story, and that somewhere in its preface, written in symbols we're still learning to read, is the record of beings who built the foundations of everything we later rediscovered and called our own. The Sumerians themselves never claimed to have invented civilization. They said they received it. Laws, writing, agriculture, astronomy, all gifts from the Anunnaki. The last of those gods, they said, departed reluctantly, leaving behind knowledge that would one day decay into legend. The king at the centre of that farewell stood as the bridge between worlds, the final ruler of the divine age and the first witness to the human one. It's tempting to imagine him in that twilight hour, standing atop a ziggurat that gleamed like gold in the fading sun, watching the waters rise or the stars shift, knowing that his time had ended. The people below him, newly mortal, would build their temples and record their names, but they would forget the rhythm of eternity. Perhaps he envied them, perhaps he pitied them, or perhaps, like all kings at the end of an age, he simply watched and understood that no reign lasts forever, not even one that spans 13,000 years. The clay tablets say he ascended to the heavens, a phrase that might have meant death, or something else entirely. In the language of Sumer, the heavens were not just the sky. They were the place of origins, the realm of the great watchers. To ascend there was not to vanish, but to return. And so, as the flood subsided and the new world began to grow, his memory lingered in the dreams of those who tilled the first post-diluvian fields. They built new cities, but they built them in the same patterns, the same sacred geometry that mirrored the stars, as if tracing the footprints of the gods who had gone before. They spoke of the me, the divine laws, the tablets of destiny that once lay in the hands of their celestial kings. Every fragment of order, every spark of invention, was said to be a remnant of the age when the Anunnaki ruled. The last of their kings, then, was not just a figure in a story. He was the threshold itself, the memory of what it meant to live in harmony with forces greater than humanity, and the grief of losing that connection. Whether you call him Enmeluana, Ziusudra, or by another name now lost, his reign marked the end of one world and the uncertain dawn of another. The centuries rolled forward, and what had once been truth became myth. But even myths have their ways of resurfacing, sometimes in the patterns of ancient maps that hint at knowledge older than the flood, sometimes in the precision of megalithic structures that align too perfectly with the stars of a vanished sky, and sometimes in the questions we still whisper when we look up and wonder whether someone once stood there, watching over the first dawn, long before we learned to measure time at all. If you listen closely to the past, it has a rhythm, not of clocks or calendars, but of return, the same stories, resurfacing, reshaped, but never entirely gone. Perhaps that's what immortality really is, not endless years, but endless remembrance. And maybe that's why the story of the last Anunnaki king still feels alive, carried quietly through generations, waiting for us to pause long enough to hear it again. Because even if the flood erased the temples and the names faded from stone, something of that world endures. In the patterns of our myths, in the pull of the stars, in the quiet conviction that we have forgotten something important, something once known, then lost, and waiting still beneath the dust. Long before the first wedge of a stylus pressed into clay, before kings counted rains or priests measured stars, there was a silence so vast it felt like the breath before a thought. That silence is where history began, not with words but with memory, not with records, but with what the ancients later called the time before names. It was the age of origins, when the world still seemed half-finished, and the boundaries between the human and the divine were as thin as dawn mist. When people told stories back then, they didn't call them myths, they called them memories. The people of Sumer, when they finally began to write, said their knowledge came from somewhere else. They didn't invent civilization, they inherited it. Agriculture, architecture, writing, mathematics, the laws of kingship, all were said to have been given to them by beings who had ruled before the flood, before the reckoning of years. These were the Anunnaki, those who came from the sky, a name that would echo through millennia of storytelling under different languages and symbols. The last Anunnaki king belonged to that forgotten age, a period so far beyond our written timeline that it blurs the line between legend and archaeology. When you try to imagine such a time, it helps to strip away what you know. Forget the map of the world as it looks now. The continents were shaped differently. The great ice sheets still crouched across the northern lands. Seas were lower, deserts were smaller, and between the rivers that would one day cradle the first cities, vast plains stretched toward horizons no one had yet thought to measure. The people of that world left almost nothing behind. No books, no monuments we can clearly read. But they did leave stories, carried in the DNA of language, the oldest inheritance of all. Those stories tell of a time when the sky was closer, when the gods dwelled among the people. They were described not as abstractions, but as beings of flesh and radiance, walking in gardens, teaching crafts, setting the rhythms of life. They ruled as kings, not distant spirits. Their temples were laboratories as much as sanctuaries, places where stone, water and fire were tamed for purposes that would seem like sorcery to those who came later. It was in those cities, Eridu, Larak, Bad Tibera, names now worn thin by millennia, that the world first learned order. The oldest king lists say that the royalty descended from heaven in Eridu. That phrase, too easily dismissed as myth, may hide a memory of something profound, a sudden appearance of knowledge, architecture and astronomy, too advanced for the apparent age of humanity. One moment, there were scattered hunter-gatherers living by riverbanks. The next, there were organised societies with irrigation systems, temples aligned to solstices, and a written script already mature in form. To archaeologists, that's an enigma. To the Sumerians, it was simple. The gods had returned, and they had brought civilization with them. And yet these gods were not eternal. They could age, grieve, and, most unsettling of all, disappear. Each generation of scribes spoke of them as having once been near, then slowly retreating. Some left for the heavens, others sank into the deep places of the earth. Their withdrawal marked the beginning of human history as we know it. Before that, there was only the age of legends, the time before names. You can still feel traces of that transition in the myths that survived. They speak of a world where everything was newly separated. Light from darkness, earth from sky, life from the dust. It wasn't just creation, it was division, a pulling apart of what had once been one. The stories say that the gods had once ruled directly, but when humanity began to awaken, to question, to desire, to build, they stepped back, leaving only a few behind to guide or watch. Some say the last Anunnaki king was one of those left behind, not because he was forgotten, but because he refused to abandon the world he had helped to shape. If you look closely, the echoes of that idea appear everywhere. In Egypt, there is the age of Zep-Tepi, the first time when gods and humans shared the earth. In Greece, there was the golden age of Kronos, when no one knew suffering or labour. In the Bible, there was Eden, where the divine walked in the cool of the day. In every telling, there's a moment when harmony breaks and time begins. Before that, the universe is timeless, cyclical, unmeasured. The moment history begins, mortality follows. The beginning of time is also the beginning of loss. It's strange how much memory can hide in plain sight. When archaeologists sift through the ruins of Sumer, they find clues that don't quite fit. Certain layers of ancient soil show traces of abrupt climate change, floods, and resettlement patterns that seem too coordinated to be coincidence. Some ancient riverbeds bear evidence of large-scale engineering. channels cut and redirected long before the supposed rise of organised states. Artefacts appear in layers where they shouldn't exist. Metallurgy before the Bronze Age, astronomical alignments carved into stone long before mathematics was formalised. None of it is conclusive, but taken together, it paints a picture of a civilization that didn't rise gradually but reappeared suddenly, as if remembering itself. In that sense, the time before names wasn't primitive, it was preparatory. It was a silence waiting to be broken by rediscovery. And when the rediscovery came, it wore the face of the gods. The first scribes, writing in cuneiform around 3000 BCE, were already looking backward. They didn't claim to be inventing history, they claimed to be recording something ancient. Their tablets spoke of kings who reigned for tens of thousands of years. Modern minds dismiss those numbers as symbolic exaggeration, but perhaps they point to something else, a kind of collective awe toward an age that seemed incomprehensibly long and impossibly advanced. Imagine being one of those early Sumerians, hearing tales passed down from your ancestors about cities swallowed by water, stars that once shone differently, teachers who came from above. You would write them down the only way you knew how, as divine genealogies, as records of gods. And if your society later rebuilt the cities of those myths on the same sites, it would only confirm what you already believed, that you were not the beginning, but the continuation of something far older. The Last Anunnaki King, in that light, becomes more than a figure in mythology. He becomes a metaphor for continuity itself, the bridge between what was divine and what became human, between a world shaped by cosmic order and one ruled by fragile memory. His long reign might not describe biological years, but epochs, ages of balance and decay, of knowledge gained and lost. When the scribes wrote that he ruled for 13,000 years, they might have been marking the span between two worlds, the age of the gods and the age of man. It's possible that the transition wasn't gentle. Some versions of the story speak of conflict among the gods, of rebellion and exile. Others suggest that their departure was an act of mercy, that the earth itself could no longer sustain their presence. There are fragments of myths describing weapons of fire, storms of ash, and cities reduced to glassy plains, details that sound unsettlingly like memories of cataclysm. In those tales, the last king's reign ends not with ceremony, but with disaster. He watches the old order collapse, the heavens darken and the seas rise, and yet in the midst of ruin, he preserves something, knowledge, law, a sense of rhythm that will guide humanity through the centuries to come. The Sumerian word for that sacred wisdom was me, a simple syllable for something vast. The me were the divine decrees, the principles of civilization, kingship, craftsmanship, music, justice, truth. They were said to be kept in heavenly tablets, guarded by the gods. When humanity proved ready, they were given, or perhaps returned to us. The last Anunnaki king, according to some interpretations, was their final guardian. His duty was not to rule forever, but to ensure that when the flood of chaos came, the me would survive. You can see echoes of that idea in how ancient people treated writing. Every sign, every wedge on a tablet was a sacred act. To write was to participate in creation. The earliest texts weren't contracts or lists. They were hymns, incantations, and histories of the gods. To the Sumerians, writing wasn't invented. It was remembered. A rediscovery of what had once been known before history had a name. It's an eerie thought, isn't it? That we might be the descendants of a memory rather than the inventors of it. That civilization itself might be less of an invention and more of a return. Every time a new city rises, every time a human hand aligns stone with the stars, perhaps we're reenacting something older than we realise. Even now there are places that seem to carry that weight of remembrance. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, older than any known temple, older than agriculture itself, show an architecture of precision and intention that seems out of place for its time. Massive stone pillars arranged in circular patterns, carved with animals, celestial symbols, and abstract forms. No sign of permanent habitation nearby. No obvious utilitarian purpose. It looks less like the beginning of civilization and more like the remnant of one. When archaeologists uncovered it, they had to confront an uncomfortable possibility that humans didn't learn how to build temples after they settled into cities. They may have already known how, and building those temples is what made them settle. That flips the usual timeline upside down. Instead of evolution from simple to complex, we might be looking at recovery, a remembering of techniques once lost. If that's true, then the time before names wasn't empty. It was full of knowledge, full of patterns, full of stories waiting for new voices to tell them again. And in those stories, the Anunnaki stand as the keepers of continuity, the ones who held the torch through a darkness we barely understand. The flood myths, the cosmic wars, the gods who walk away, these might all be metaphors for the same process. A world resets itself. The old order ends. Survivors carry fragments of memory forward, building anew on the ruins of what came before. The last Anunnaki King becomes the personification of that endurance. He is not just a ruler who lived too long. He's the echo of everything that refused to vanish. When you think about it that way, even our modern fascination with ancient mysteries becomes part of the same pattern. We keep digging, literally and figuratively, because something in us recognizes that not all knowledge is linear. Some of it loops back, resurfacing when we're ready to hear it. The Sumerians said the gods would return when humanity remembered their ways. Maybe they already have, not as beings descending from the sky, but as questions rising from the earth. And perhaps that's what the time before names really was. A memory field, waiting to be reactivated by curiosity. Each discovery, each decoding, is like a fragment of that old order flickering back to life. The flood may have washed the world clean, but it didn't erase its blueprint. It only hid it beneath layers of time, where we could find it again slowly, piece by piece. When the first cities of Sumer began to shine under the Mesopotamian sun, their builders still followed the same patterns of the old world. Their temples faced the stars, their gods carried symbols of wings and light, and their kings were measured not just by power, but by proximity to the divine. They weren't inventing a civilization from nothing. They were reawakening one. So perhaps the last Anunnaki king never truly vanished. Perhaps he lived on in the laws, in the mathematics of the ziggurats, in the rhythm of rituals that mimicked celestial motions. His reign, measured in impossible numbers, might have been humanity's first and longest lesson. A reminder that knowledge, once gained, never disappears completely. It waits, hidden beneath the dust until someone dares to remember. And that remembering, that quiet act of recognition, is how history truly begins. Not with writing, not with stone, but with the awareness that there was something before. Something vast, luminous, and unwilling to be forgotten. The world after the flood would call it myth. We, thousands of years later, call it prehistory. But to the ones who lived through it, it was simply life. The closing of one long age and the uncertain dawn of another. And somewhere in that twilight stood a king who had seen both, the last of his kind, watching as the world learned, for the first time, how to measure time itself. There's an image that lingers in the old stories, one that blurs the line between reverence and memory. It's the picture of a world where the divine was not imagined above but present among, where gods walked beside men. It sounds like myth, the kind of phrase that would appear on the opening line of a tablet meant to be recited by candlelight. Yet the people who first told those stories did not speak of it as something distant or symbolic. To them, it was history, the time when heaven and earth were still one realm. In those early days, before kingship became mortal, the Sumerians said that the royalty descended from heaven. It was not just a poetic expression. It was their literal explanation for how order began. They believed that the laws of life, the structure of society, the calendar of the stars, all came from beings who governed both sky and soil. The Anunnaki were those beings. They were not yet remote figures trapped in temple statues. They were rulers, teachers, and overseers. They built cities, taught agriculture, and established the rules that kept the world balanced. The last of them, the king whose reign would span 13 millennia, belonged to that age when the divine still left footprints in wet clay. To imagine that time, it helps to think of a world that was smaller, quieter, and perhaps stranger than ours. The first cities, if they can even be called that, were little more than clusters of mud brick structures rising beside rivers that shifted their courses like restless serpents. Around them stretched marshes where reeds grew taller than a man, where fish and birds sustained life through the long seasons of flood and drought. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and smoke from simple fires. And then, as the stories say, came the ones from the sky, the bright visitors, the watchers, the teachers. They did not descend in storms of thunder or light, at least not in the Sumerian imagination. Their coming was described as serene, almost ritualistic. The tablets say they set down in Eridu, a phrase that carries the calm weight of something deliberate, like the opening of a great book. There they built the first temple, the House of the Waters, said to contain the essence of creation itself. From that place, the balance of the world was governed. Each of the Anunnaki had their domain, the seas, the winds, the harvests, the stars, but above them all was the ruler, the one who held the bond between heaven and earth. It is difficult for modern minds to separate myth from possible memory, yet across cultures there is the same pattern. A golden age when gods or divine beings lived among humans and guided them. In Egypt, the pharaohs traced their descent from the gods who ruled before them. In Central America, the Toltecs and later the Maya spoke of the return of feathered serpents, divine kings who brought wisdom and law. In Greece, the age of Kronos was a time when men and gods shared the same feasts. Even the Hebrew scriptures begin with a garden where the Creator walks among his creations. In every version, there is companionship first, then distance. A separation that becomes the birth of religion, the yearning to reconnect with something that once was natural. Archaeology adds a curious layer to the story. When you study the ruins of early Sumer, you find temples far older than the cities around them. The earliest layers show shrines that appear to have been rebuilt repeatedly, each on top of the last, as if generations were trying to preserve the exact footprint of something sacred. Some of those foundations align precisely with solstices and equinoxes, with the rising and setting of particular stars. These were not random designs. Whoever built them understood geometry, astronomy and engineering to a degree far beyond what is expected for the supposed birth of civilization. The first cities were not built around markets or walls. They were built around temples. The centre of life was always the place where heaven once touched the earth. The Anunnaki were not described as omnipotent in the stories. They were powerful, but they had emotions, pride, jealousy, compassion, fatigue. They could love and rage, build and destroy. In the oldest myths, they appear almost human, except for one crucial difference. They were closer to the source of creation. They remembered what humans had forgotten. The last of their kings, the one who would live to see the flood, was said to be both teacher and guardian. His role was to keep the world in balance, to ensure that the divine order, what the Sumerians called me, was upheld. The me were the hidden rules behind existence, the patterns that governed everything from the movement of rivers to the making of music. They weren't moral laws, but structural ones, like the invisible framework that holds a building upright. To the Sumerians, the world wasn't random. It was organized according to these principles, and those principles were kept by the gods. When humanity followed them, the world was stable. When they were forgotten or defied, chaos returned. One story tells of a goddess who stole the me from the king and fled to another city, spreading confusion and innovation wherever she went. It's an odd mixture. the theft of cosmic order leading to creativity. Perhaps that was the Sumerians' way of explaining how progress happens, through disorder. Even the gods in their stories couldn't control what they had started. Civilization once given took on a life of its own. When the gods walked beside men, the lines were clearer. People knew their place in the great pattern. The kings were mediators, not rulers in the modern sense. They served as translators between the divine and the mortal, interpreters of the laws that had been handed down from the sky. The last Anunnaki king embodied that balance perfectly. He was said to have lived so long because he carried within him the harmony that held the world together. His reign lasted until that harmony was broken. If you read the old myths carefully, you begin to see a quiet sadness behind their grandeur. The gods are always leaving. In one tablet, a divine council meets to decide the fate of mankind, debating whether the world should be remade. In another, a god grows weary of the noise and chaos of human life. The flood that ends the first age is described not just as punishment, but as exhaustion, a divine withdrawal from a world that had grown unmanageable. The Last King's story sits right on that boundary, between presence and absence, between divine patience and human independence. And yet, even as the gods receded, their influence remained etched into the architecture of life. The Sumerians built their cities according to heavenly patterns. Each ziggurat mirrored the mountain of creation, each tier representing a level of the cosmos. To climb its steps was to ascend symbolically toward the realm of the gods. Inside those temples, priests tracked the movements of the planets, believing them to be the living bodies of the deities who had once walked among them. They didn't study astronomy as a science. They studied it as a conversation, a way of reading the gestures of the divine in the language of light. There's something deeply human about that image, a civilization looking upward, trying to maintain a relationship that has grown distant. The gods had once walked beside them, but now only the stars echoed their steps. Still, the people continued to build, to measure, to align, as if by precision alone they could rebuild the bridge. Every temple was a memory made of stone. Every ritual a kind of reenactment of those days when the divine and the human shared the same ground. You can still feel it today in the way we speak about the past. We call ancient places sacred, as if holiness lingers in architecture, not just belief. We visit ruins and feel a hush, a kind of inherited reverence. Maybe it's superstition, or maybe it's recognition. Perhaps deep down, something in us remembers what it was like to live in a world where the boundary between heaven and earth was not so fixed. Even science in its own way chases that memory. Every telescope, every probe sent into space, every attempt to map the stars is part of the same impulse, the desire to reconnect with the origin of things. The Sumerians looked up at constellations and saw the faces of gods. We look up and see the remnants of creation itself. Hydrogen clouds, supernovae, galaxies spinning across time. The difference is only language, the longing is the same. The last Anunnaki king, whoever he truly was, represents the turning point when that longing began. His reign ended when the gods could no longer stay among men, when the balance of the old order gave way to a new world of mortality and uncertainty. Some myths say he refused to leave, choosing instead to remain as a guardian of the hidden wisdom. Others say he departed with the rest, promising to return when humanity was ready to remember what it had forgotten. In both versions, his story marks the same truth, that separation was not the end but the beginning of history as we know it. Because once the gods left, humans had to take their place. They began to rule, to build, to interpret, to create. The divine spark didn't vanish, it changed hands. Kingship descended from heaven, and then it was passed to flesh and blood. The first mortal kings of Sumer claimed descent from the gods not out of arrogance, but out of inheritance. They believed they were continuing a task, maintaining an order once established by those luminous teachers. It's easy to forget that for the Sumerians, there was no clean line between religion and science, between myth and observation. To them, studying the world was an act of devotion. Measuring a field was not just mathematics, it was participation in divine geometry. Observing the stars was not curiosity, it was communication. The world was alive with intention. Every river, every mountain, every grain of sand had a purpose within the cosmic design. The gods may have stepped back, but their fingerprints remained everywhere. Over time, the memory of their presence became formalized into ritual. The more distant they seemed, the more precise the rituals became. Incantations replaced conversations. Offerings replaced companionship. The temples grew higher, perhaps to bridge a growing gap. And yet, at the heart of it all was still the same yearning, to restore what had once been effortless, the companionship of gods and men. In the fragments that mention the last king, there's a peculiar tenderness. He is not portrayed as a tyrant or a conqueror, but as a caretaker. The flood that ended his world is not his failure, it's his burden. He stands as the last witness to the time before separation, the last to hold both knowledge and memory of the unity that once was. When his reign ends, the gods withdraw completely, and the age of men begins, and still, every civilization that followed tried to rebuild that connection in its own way. The Egyptians built pyramids to echo the steps of heaven. The Maya tracked the stars with impossible precision. The Greeks filled their myths with half-divine heroes. Even in the modern age, the question hasn't changed. Where did we come from, and what have we lost along the way? Maybe the Sumerians were trying to answer that too. When they said that the gods once walked beside men, they were describing more than just beings of power. They were remembering a kind of harmony, a time when life felt ordered, when knowledge and faith were the same thing, when the earth itself seemed to speak. And when they spoke of the last king, they weren't mourning a ruler's death. They were mourning the loss of that nearness, the end of a world where everything sacred was also familiar. If the gods once walked beside men, maybe what they left behind was not just temples or myths, but the idea that knowledge itself is sacred, that understanding the world is a form of reverence. Perhaps that's why their stories still resonate, why we keep unearthing the same symbols, the same alignments, the same questions. We're still trying to walk beside them, even if the path now leads through time instead of through fields of ancient clay. And somewhere, in the long memory of the earth, the echo of their footsteps remains. It hums through the ruins, through the language of stone and the rhythm of stars. It's faint, but it's there. The memory of when the gods walked beside men, and of the king who watched them go. When the old tablets speak of a kingdom that lasted for thousands upon thousands of years, they do not describe it as a miracle. They describe it as memory. The ancient scribes wrote of the first city, Eridu, as if it had always been there, built not by human hands, but by those who knew how to shape the world with intention alone. They called it the foundation, the beginning, the place where heaven met earth. It was said that the laws of creation themselves were written into its streets, that the rivers bent slightly to its will, and that the stars above traced their patterns in silent tribute to its design. That was the heart of the kingdom of endless years. The world as it was before mortality became the measure of time. The Sumerians believed that before the flood, the reigns of kings stretched across tens of thousands of years, each one a cycle of perfect balance between the divine and the human. To us, it sounds impossible. To them, it was evidence of a world where death had not yet become the rule, where life was still intertwined with the eternal. The first kings were not men trying to live forever. They were beings for whom the concept of an ending simply did not exist. The tablets say that kingship descended from heaven, and once it did, it stayed in Eridu. The city grew around a temple called Abzu, the House of the Deep Waters. It was not merely a building, but a symbol, a model of the cosmos itself, where the visible world and the hidden one met. The ruler of that city was not just a king, but a bridge between realms. He governed the cycles of nature, the flooding of the rivers, the fertility of the soil, the alignment of the heavens. His word was both decree and harmony. The people saw him as the embodiment of order itself. When he walked among them, they believed the universe was balanced. The descriptions of that kingdom do not dwell on conquest or wealth. They speak instead of stability, of a peace that endured longer than anyone could count. The city thrived not through war but through understanding. Each temple was a place of study as much as worship. The priests were astronomers, engineers, healers, and scribes, all part of a single system that viewed knowledge as sacred duty. To learn was to serve the gods. To measure the stars was to maintain the order they had set in motion. In that world, time was not linear. It circled. The seasons returned not as reminders of decay, but as affirmations of eternity. Crops grew and withered and grew again. The river rose and fell in rhythm, a living metronome of divine patience. The people who lived in that kingdom did not measure years as we do. They marked moments, the flooding of the plain, the return of certain constellations, the ripening of the grain. The king's reign, said to last 13,000 years, might have been less a number and more a symbol for unbroken continuity. As long as he ruled, the world renewed itself. Archaeology offers small glimpses into that long peace. In the ruins of Eridu, layer upon layer of temples lies buried beneath the sand. Each generation built a new sanctuary directly atop the old, preserving its alignment, its proportions, even the orientation of its foundation. 19 times they rebuilt it, each one a continuation rather than a replacement. That's not how you build when you're chasing progress. That's how you build when you're trying to preserve something sacred. The people of that kingdom did not see themselves as inventors. They saw themselves as caretakers of a pattern that already existed. And yet, within that perfection, there was tension. The Sumerian myths describe the gods as both teachers and overseers, generous but demanding. They provided abundance, but they expected obedience. Humanity was created to serve, to maintain the temples, to offer food and praise to the heavens. It was an arrangement of order, not equality. The king, standing between these two worlds, bore the burden of balance. His role was to mediate between divine will and human need, to keep the favour of the gods while protecting the lives of those who depended on him. The story suggests that he succeeded, for a time. But the longer the peace lasted, the more fragile it became. Humanity began to grow restless. Knowledge had been given, but not all knowledge. Power had been shared, but not fully. In some tablets, there's a quiet sense of rebellion, of humankind beginning to question the arrangement. The fields were fruitful, but the temples demanded much. The people worked for the gods, but the gods seemed distant. The balance began to tremble. One story describes how the king, out of compassion, began to teach more than he was permitted to. He shared knowledge meant only for the divine, how to read the movement of the heavens, how to shape metal from the earth, how to draw power from water and fire. The gods, it is said, warned him. Wisdom belonged to the heavens, not to mortals. But the king persisted. He believed the time had come for humanity to stand beside the gods, not beneath them. And so the first fracture appeared in the kingdom of endless years. It's an old theme, the giving of forbidden knowledge, the bridge between worlds becoming too open. You can see it reflected later in myths from every culture. Prometheus stealing fire, the serpent offering wisdom, the tower reaching heaven. In each a line is crossed, and the old harmony collapses. In the Sumerian telling, the consequence was not immediate. The gods debated. Some pitied the king's devotion, others saw it as betrayal. The balance held a little longer, long enough for one last golden age before the flood. During that final stretch of peace, the kingdom achieved a level of refinement that the tablets struggle to describe. They speak of gardens where everything bloomed in its season, of irrigation systems that carried water like veins across the land, of temples that glowed with a light not of fire but of reflection, polished stone, gold leaf and lapis catching the sun. They say that the king's court kept libraries of clay inscribed with every art and law. Music filled the evenings. The people lived without hunger. It was a civilization in perfect equilibrium with the world around it. And maybe that was its undoing. Perfection, after all, invites curiosity. When nothing changes, even peace can feel like confinement. The gods had made humanity to serve, but in serving they learned, and in learning they began to imagine what it might mean to be free. The king's empathy toward his people made him their advocate, but also their shield. He stood between their rising ambition and the divine order that demanded obedience. In that fragile space, the first cracks appeared in eternity. The texts hint that the gods grew impatient. They met in secret, deciding the fate of both the king and his kingdom. Some proposed to remove him quietly, to replace him with one more compliant. Others argued for restraint. The king had been loyal, after all. He had preserved their order for longer than any before him. But the balance was slipping, and the flood of change, literal or otherwise, was inevitable. In the end, they chose withdrawal. The gods would step back. The kingdom would stand or fall by its own hand. That decision marked the end of the age of divine kingship. The king, realizing what was coming, gathered his scribes and priests. He ordered them to record everything, every law, every symbol, every measure of the stars. If the gods were leaving, the knowledge must stay, and so they wrote, pressing memory into clay, sealing it with their signatures and prayers. They buried archives in sealed chambers, hidden beneath the temples. The act of writing became their ark. The kingdom of endless years began to prepare for its own forgetting. When the floods finally came, they were described not just as water, but as time itself, erasing the old world. The rivers rose beyond their banks, the seas advanced across the plains, the winds scoured the fields, temples were swallowed, the cities dissolved into mud. The king's reign ended not with conquest or rebellion, but with silence. The waters receded, and when they did, the world was changed. Mortality had arrived. Kingship would rise again, but this time in human hands. In the centuries that followed, people remembered the old kingdom as a dream of impossible duration. They spoke of it with awe and longing. Its ruins became sacred ground. The first post-flood rulers claimed descent from its king, though none could match his span or wisdom. The age of endless years had become the age of numbered ones. The divine order had been replaced by the fragile rhythm of mortality, yet the pattern endured. The temples were rebuilt on the same foundations, the rituals performed in the same sequence. The stars still watched for signs of favour. The new kings might have been human, but they ruled as if remembering something older. Even now, when you stand among the remains of Eridu, there's a quiet that feels deliberate. The wind moves across the mounds, carrying the smell of salt and dust. The outlines of the old temple barely rise above the plain, but if you look long enough, you can almost see the shape of what once was, a place where order and eternity met. The stones are broken, but the plan is still there, as if waiting for someone to rebuild it again. Some researchers believe the memory of that kingdom may have travelled farther than Sumer. Fragments of its story appear in the myths of distant peoples, in the tales of Atlantis, in the chronicles of Zep-Tepi, in the legends of the lost Golden Age. Perhaps those are all reflections of the same origin, a collective memory of a time when civilization seemed effortless, because it was guided by something greater. Others see it more metaphorically. The kingdom of endless years might not have been a literal empire, but an idea, a vision of harmony that humanity carries like a seed. Every culture has imagined a paradise at the beginning, a time of balance and abundance that was lost but not forgotten. Maybe that's why we keep trying to rebuild it. Every city we plan, every law we codify, every temple or library or observatory we construct is an echo of that first order. We keep reaching for the perfection we remember, but can never quite restore. The Sumerians didn't speak of the past as gone. To them, the past was a layer beneath the present, still alive, still influencing the world above it. Time, like the earth itself, was built in strata. The kingdom of endless years wasn't destroyed. It was buried beneath rivers, beneath memory, beneath the slow drift of ages. Its knowledge, they believed, remained intact, sleeping under the dust. And perhaps that's why the legend of the last king endured for so long. He wasn't gone, he was waiting. Every rediscovery of ancient wisdom feels like part of that return. When modern scientists decode star maps carved thousands of years ago, when archaeologists uncover irrigation systems older than expected, when linguists trace words back to their primordial roots, in each of these there's the faint echo of something deliberate, as if humanity is piecing together instructions left long ago. The kingdom of endless years may have fallen, but its rhythm continues, pulsing quietly through the ages, guiding us back toward what we once knew. In the end, the story of that kingdom is not about its fall, but about endurance. Nothing truly vanishes, not even civilizations. They change form, they migrate, they whisper through myth and architecture. The Anunnaki may have left the Earth, but the structure of their order still shapes us. The way we measure, build, govern and dream still follows the same patterns. The kingdom might be gone from the world, but not from the mind. The scribes of Sumer began their history with the phrase, "When kingship descended from heaven." They never said it left, they only said it moved, from one age to another, from gods to men, from endless years to fleeting ones. And perhaps that is what eternity really means. Not living forever, but remembering forever. The kingdom may have ended, but its memory became the blueprint for every world that followed. And somewhere beneath the dust of southern Mesopotamia, under layers of silt and salt, the foundations of that first city still rest. They are silent now, but not empty. They wait, as they always have, for the day when someone listens closely enough to hear what they still have to say. Among the fragments of clay unearthed from the oldest layers of Mesopotamia, there are recurring references to something the scribes called the Tablets of Destiny. They were said to have been written not by men, but by the gods themselves, records that bound the laws of heaven and earth, inscribed in a language older than sound, perhaps even older than matter. These were not books in the sense we know them, nor mere symbols of authority. They were the blueprints of the cosmos. Whoever held them, the stories say, held the power to rule not just nations, but the balance of existence itself. The Anunnaki ruled through these tablets, and through them the world was ordered. When archaeologists first deciphered the term, they thought it might refer to a kind of royal charter, a mythic explanation for kingship, like a divine constitution. But the deeper you read into the ancient texts, the more the meaning widens. The Tablets of Destiny were said to regulate everything from the rising of the stars to the beating of a human heart. They were cosmic instruments of calibration, and their keeper, the ruler of the Anunnaki, governed not by decree, but by maintaining the harmony they described. The kingdom that lasted for thousands of years, that endless age of calm, was guided by these tablets. They were the silent machinery of order. The Sumerians spoke of them as physical objects, thin plates, radiant, sometimes described as shimmering like the surface of water or glowing with a light that needed no fire. They were guarded in the temple of Enlil, one of the high gods, but their origin was always traced back to the heavens. According to one story, they fell from the sky. Another says they were brought down deliberately, as gifts to the early rulers who proved worthy of maintaining the divine order on earth. Each account agrees on one thing: they were not written by human hands. If you listen carefully to how the ancients described them, you can sense that the tablets were not just objects but principles. They were knowledge personified. To hold them was to understand the rhythm of creation, the alignment of the stars, the turning of the seasons, the cycles of birth and decay. The gods ruled by understanding, not domination. Theirs was not the tyranny of power, but the authority of balance. The Tablets of Destiny were the embodiment of that idea, the notion that true rule comes from alignment with the fabric of reality itself. When the Anunnaki walked among men, they did not rule through armies. Their control was quieter, more structural. They taught the early cities how to live in rhythm with the environment. They established calendars, agricultural systems, methods of irrigation that followed celestial timing. The king, as the living intermediary, enforced those cycles, ensuring that the festivals, plantings and offerings all mirrored the greater movements of the heavens. The rule of the Anunnaki, as described in the tablets, was essentially a synchronization between earth and sky. One ancient hymn describes it beautifully, though the translation loses some of its cadence. They placed the stars like words upon the night. They set the rivers as veins upon the land. The king read their signs and kept the world in motion. That idea, that governance was a form of cosmic literacy, permeated Sumerian thought. To rule well was to read correctly, to interpret the divine script written into the universe. The tablets of destiny were, in that sense, both literal and symbolic. They represented the knowledge that kept existence coherent. The myths also tell of times when the tablets were stolen or lost. Each time, chaos followed. The winds changed direction, the rivers flooded without warning, crops failed, and the order of the heavens faltered. These stories may have been allegories for natural disasters, storms, famines, shifts in the seasons, but to the Sumerians they were cosmic warnings. Lose the tablets, lose the world. The gods themselves could quarrel and falter, but as long as the tablets remained in the rightful hands, the balance endured. It's tempting to read those myths as metaphors for knowledge, for the idea that civilization depends on memory. Perhaps the tablets of destiny were never real objects, but representations of the stored wisdom that made life stable, the knowledge of the stars, the flood patterns, the mathematics of measurement, the ethics of cooperation. When that knowledge was preserved, society thrived. When it was forgotten, the world collapsed into confusion. And maybe that's why the ancients framed it in divine terms. To them, knowledge was not invented, it was revealed. The act of remembering was a sacred duty. If you stand in a museum today and look at a Sumerian tablet, covered in tiny wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay 5,000 years ago, you're seeing a faint reflection of that belief. Writing was born from the same impulse that gave us the myths of the tablets of destiny. The urge to fix the transient, to preserve order against the dissolving flow of time. The earliest texts are not ledgers or treaties, but hymns and star charts. Even when they seem mundane, lists of grain or cattle, they follow a rhythm that mirrors the cycles of nature. Each tally, each line, was part of maintaining the divine balance. The pen was a tool of cosmology before it was a tool of commerce. In that sense, the rule of the Anunnaki might not have been about rule at all, but stewardship. They were depicted as beings of immense knowledge, concerned with precision and pattern, endlessly attentive to the harmony of the world. The king, the one who reigned for those impossible years, was less a monarch than a custodian. His palace was described not as a fortress, but as a place of alignment, an observatory, a sanctuary, a library of the heavens. Some modern scholars find intriguing correspondences between the layout of ancient cities and the positions of stars visible in their time. The ziggurats of Uruk and Eridu, for example, seem to echo constellations when seen from above. The arrangement of temples follows astronomical logic that would not be rediscovered for millennia. Whether this was intentional or coincidence is hard to prove, but the idea fits the old narrative perfectly. The world below built to mirror the world above. The Anunnaki ruled by reflection. They saw the earth as a canvas on which the pattern of heaven was copied. And then there's the question of where that knowledge came from. The Sumerians never claimed ownership of it. They always credited the gods. The Anunnaki were the transmitters, the ones who brought wisdom from elsewhere. Some traditions say they came from the stars, from a realm called Nibiru, or the crossing place. Others interpret that name differently, seeing it not as a location but as a state, the place where orbits intersect, where divine and earthly cycles overlap. In either case, the message was the same: knowledge came from beyond. The king, as its earthly vessel, was the living bridge. It's striking how similar that idea is to concepts found in other ancient cultures. The Egyptians spoke of Thoth, the god who wrote the laws of the cosmos and gave writing to mankind. The Greeks had Hermes, the messenger between worlds. In India there was Vishvakarman, the divine architect who structured reality itself. Each culture seems to have preserved a version of the same archetype, a figure or order that writes the rules of existence, and the danger that follows when those rules are broken. The Sumerian myths go further, suggesting that the tablets of destiny could alter reality if misused. In one legend, a rebellious god named Anzu steals them from the throne room of Enlil. For a brief time he becomes invincible, commanding storms and earthquakes, but the world itself begins to unravel. The sun falters, the sky dims, the gods panic and send heroes to retrieve the tablets. When they are recovered and returned to their rightful place, the world stabilizes again. The moral is simple but profound. Power without alignment leads to chaos. Knowledge without responsibility destroys order. If you look at that through a modern lens, it sounds almost prophetic. The ancients may have understood something timeless about the relationship between knowledge and balance. The tablets of destiny are, in a way, the first story about data, about who controls information and what happens when it's misused. In that light, the myths feel less like fantasy and more like commentary on the eternal fragility of wisdom. In the time of the last Anunnaki King, the tablets were said to be whole and undisturbed. The world moved in perfect rhythm. But as rebellion stirred and the gods debated, rumours spread that the tablets were being hidden, fragmented or rewritten. Some said the king himself had begun to alter them, not out of malice, but to protect humanity from divine retribution. He encoded knowledge within myths, concealed truths within symbols, ensured that even if the flood came, the essence of the tablets would survive in stories, in architecture, in ritual. Whether true or not, the result is visible. Fragments of cosmic order scattered through human culture like seeds waiting to be rediscovered. Consider how civilizations thousands of years apart, built according to the same geometric ratios, the same stellar alignments, the same fascination with the number 60, the base of Sumerian mathematics, Egypt, Babylon, the Indus Valley, Mesoamerica, all using cycles that match celestial constants. Some coincidence, perhaps, or perhaps a lingering memory of the same system once recorded on the tablets of destiny. The myth ends, as many do, with loss. The flood sweeps away the temples, the archives, the tablets themselves. Only fragments remain, enough to rebuild, but never enough to restore the old perfection. The Anunnaki withdraw, their rule over the physical world ending. Yet the memory of the tablets endures, transmuted into human striving. The first scholars, the first astronomers, the first lawgivers, all trace their inspiration to that vanished knowledge. The rule of the gods becomes the rule of reason, and the king's stewardship becomes humanity's task. Even now, echoes of that legacy shape how we see the universe. Our modern sciences, physics, astronomy, mathematics, are built on the same conviction that the world follows order. We seek the equations that govern matter and motion, the constants that underlie chaos. When we speak of laws of nature, we're using language inherited from the age of the Anunnaki. The difference is only in scope. We no longer call the keepers of those laws gods, but the pursuit is the same: to read the tablets of the sky. Sometimes it's easy to forget how long we've been trying to do that. The astronomers of Babylon, descendants of Sumer's scribes, charted the paths of the planets with astonishing precision. Their clay tablets record eclipses, solstices, and conjunctions over centuries. They weren't merely predicting, they were reenacting the old stewardship, maintaining balance through understanding. Each observation was a small act of reverence, a continuation of the covenant that began in Eridu. The king who ruled for endless years would have understood it perfectly. His task was never to command the world, but to read it, to hold the tablets, literal or metaphorical, and ensure that the pattern held. When he finally disappeared from the records, the world didn't end. It changed authors. Humanity took up the stylus. The clay was passed to our hands, and in every equation, every map of the stars, every attempt to define what the universe is made of, the same story continues to unfold. The Anunnaki may have vanished from sight, but the rule of their tablets never really ended. It became the grammar of our curiosity, the order that still whispers beneath chaos. The stars above us are still inscribed with the same patterns, and perhaps somewhere beyond their light, the memory of that first library still glows, waiting for us to read it again. For a very long time, the world beneath the Anunnaki's gaze seemed fixed and sure of itself. The rivers flowed when they were meant to, the crops rose and fell in time with the stars, and the people moved through their days as if guided by invisible hands. The gods still walked among them, not as distant powers but as governors of balance, each one responsible for a piece of the world's rhythm. It had been that way for so long that no one could remember a beginning. And then, almost imperceptibly, something began to change. No one could say when the first sign appeared. Some tablets speak of a season that lingered too long, a harvest that came late. Others mention omens in the sky, stars out of place, a red moon, the air trembling with an unfamiliar stillness. At first, the priest dismissed it. The heavens had their own cycles, some beyond even divine prediction. But as the disturbances continued, an unease spread. The harmony that had held the world together for thousands of years was faltering. The people didn't understand it yet, but the order of heaven was beginning to break. The old hymns called that period the dimming. It was not an apocalypse, not yet. It was more like a slow fading of clarity, as if the rules that governed existence were losing their sharpness. The gods themselves began to disagree. Some wanted to tighten control to remind humankind of its place. Others believed the world had to evolve, that humans were meant to carry the spark forward. The last Anunnaki king, who had ruled longer than memory itself, stood at the centre of that conflict. His purpose had always been to preserve balance, but now balance itself was in question. The stories say he convened the Council of the Seven, the principal deities who governed the cosmos. They gathered in the great hall of Ekur, the mountain temple of Enlil, where the air shimmered with the weight of power. The debate that followed was not a thunderous quarrel, but a weary one. The gods were not angry, they were tired. They had shaped the world, tended it, and guided it through eons, but humanity was restless, unpredictable. The people had begun to question, to invent, to look beyond the boundaries that had been set for them. It was not rebellion yet, but curiosity, something even the gods could not control. In the oldest fragments of the myth, the king argues for mercy. He tells the assembly that the humans are not defiant, only awakening. They were made in the image of the divine. How could they not desire to know? He urges patience, guidance, teaching. But the others fear that if left unchecked, mankind will unmake what has been so carefully built. Some suggest withdrawing the me, the divine decrees, to prevent further corruption. Others whisper of cleansing, of water rising, of renewal through destruction. The king listens, knowing what such a choice would mean. The decision did not come in a single moment. It formed gradually like a storm gathering on the horizon. The gods began to retreat from their duties. The stars no longer moved in perfect harmony. Floods came when they were not expected. The seasons slipped. It was as though the gears of heaven were grinding against each other. The king tried to hold the pattern together, using the tablets of destiny to restore balance, but even they began to resist him. What had once responded to his will now flickered unpredictably. The code of the cosmos was unravelling. To the people of Sumer, it must have seemed like the world itself was losing its mind. The floods grew higher each year, the skies darker. Fields that had yielded abundance turned to mud or dust. Priests who read the omens found contradictions in every sign. One night, the moon glowed blood red and then vanished for hours. The watchers panicked, thinking the heavens had closed their eyes. That was when the first temples began to crumble, not from war or neglect, but from disuse. The gods, it seemed, had gone silent. In one tablet, cracked and half erased, there is a single haunting line. The king stood alone before the altar and the stars did not answer. It's only a fragment, but it captures something powerful, a moment of realization that even the divine can feel abandoned. The king, once surrounded by light, was now a solitary figure in a world coming undone. He sent messengers to the far cities, Eridu, Uruk, Sipar, calling the priests to gather to perform the great rites of renewal. But the messages returned unanswered. The priests were gone, or the cities drowned, or the people too weary to care. What followed is described differently in every version of the story. Some say the gods themselves began to quarrel, their conflict spilling into the world below. Storms and earthquakes mirrored their anger. Others suggest that humanity, in its desperation, turned against the temples, looting the sacred spaces, melting down idols for survival. Either way, the connection between heaven and earth was breaking. The songs grew quieter, the rituals faltered. The order that had bound gods and men for ages was dissolving into noise, and still the king refused to surrender. The myths describe him walking among the ruins of his cities, speaking softly to the wind, as if reminding the world of the old harmony. He rebuilt what he could, repaired walls, restored canals. He taught the survivors to plant again, to look to the sky for signs of the returning light. For a time, it seemed to work. The floods receded, the sun returned. The old patterns flickered back into alignment, but it was only a pause, a breath before the inevitable. Some versions say that the king sought counsel from the heavens one last time. He went to the mountain where the gods had once descended and waited there for 7 days. On the 7th night the sky opened, not with light, but with sound, a deep, vibrating hum that shook the stones. From that darkness came a voice, not angry, not kind, simply final. It told him that the age of the gods was ending, that the balance had to shift. Humanity was ready to inherit the world, but to do so, the old order must die. The king asked if there was any other way. The voice did not answer. He returned to his city knowing what was coming. He gathered his scribes, his builders, his astronomers, and instructed them to record everything. The cycles of the stars, the principles of measurement, the laws of harmony. He told them to seal the records in chambers of stone, deep enough to survive even the anger of the sea. Then he sent them away, scattering them across the land to preserve fragments of memory wherever they could. It was not defiance, it was preparation. The end could not be stopped, but forgetting could. When the flood came, it did not come as rain. It came as a rising of the deep. The rivers swelled beyond their channels, merging into a single vast expanse. The wind howled for days. The sky turned grey and did not change. For 40 days, according to one version, the water rose without pause. Cities vanished beneath it. Mountains became islands. The king's palace, once shining with gold and stone, disappeared under the waves. And yet, in the aftermath, the story says his words survived. The instructions buried beneath the temples, written in clay that hardened as the fires and floods cooled. It is strange how memory endures even when the world does not. Thousands of years later, when the archaeologists of modern times uncovered the remains of Sumer, they found layers of sediment that told a story no less dramatic than the myth. Traces of a massive flood covering multiple cities at once. Evidence of sudden abandonment, followed by slow rebuilding. The pattern was there, half historical, half legendary. Perhaps that is how truths survive, by taking refuge in myth when the facts become too fragile. The fall of heaven's order was not just a cataclysm, it was a transition. It marked the moment when the guardians of eternity stepped back, and time began to flow freely again. From that point on, years could be counted, generations born and gone. Mortality took root in a world that had once seemed timeless. The divine withdrew into story, and humanity became its own steward. It was loss, but also inheritance. In later myths, the gods who survived the flood returned only in dreams and symbols. They became constellations, mountains, echoes in sacred chants. The king himself was said to have ascended into the heavens, not as a conqueror but as a witness, carrying with him the last intact memory of the old order. Some believed he became a star watching over the new world. Others said he entered the earth instead, guarding the buried tablets until the time was right to reveal them again. Whichever version you believe, his departure marked the closing of an age. The Sumerians, in their quiet way, never portrayed the fall as punishment. To them, it was renewal. The gods had not destroyed the world out of spite. They had reset it, giving humanity the chance to begin again without the burden of eternity. In that sense, the flood was not an end, but a rebalancing. The divine order that had become too rigid, too perfect, had to break so that life could move forward. The king's long reign had preserved the harmony for as long as possible, but even harmony can become a cage. When the waters finally receded, the survivors found themselves in a quieter world. The temples were gone, the ziggurats buried, but the sky was still there. They began to rebuild, guided by memories of what had been. They planted new crops, mapped new stars, and retold the story of the flood and the king who had endured it. Over generations that story spread, changing shape but never losing its essence. In every version, from the Sumerian Ziusudra to the Babylonian Utnapishtim to the Hebrew Noah, it carries the same truth. Knowledge survives through catastrophe. The order of heaven may fall, but the rhythm it created remains, waiting to be rediscovered. That, perhaps, is the real meaning of the fall of heaven's order, not the collapse of a divine empire, but the moment when responsibility shifted from gods to men. The age of endless years became the age of fleeting lives, but also of awareness. Without the protection of immortals, humanity learned to measure, to plan, to remember. We built calendars to replace the stars, laws to replace decrees, and histories to replace memory. In doing so, we became the new keepers of the order that had once ruled us. The king's legacy lives in that transformation. His was the last hand to steady the world before it began to spin on its own. His story is a reminder that even the most perfect systems must eventually give way to change. The heavens may fall, but from their ruins, something new always rises. And perhaps that is the hidden mercy behind the myth, that every ending, even one written in the stars, is also a beginning waiting to be named. Somewhere deep beneath the plains of Mesopotamia, the old cities still sleep under the silt. The rivers have shifted, the stones have crumbled, but if you listen to the wind there, you might still catch the faint rhythm of the ancient balance, a whisper of the order that once held heaven and earth together. It's not loud, it doesn't need to be. It's the sound of endurance, of memory refusing to fade. The story continues, not because it was preserved perfectly, but because it was remembered imperfectly, passed from voice to voice like an ember kept alive through the dark. And so the fall was never absolute. The divine didn't vanish. It changed shape. The heavens didn't collapse. They expanded, making room for us. The king didn't die. He became the measure of all rulers who came after. His reign ended, but his purpose remains the same, to keep the world aligned, even if only through the stories we tell about him. The world we know now was born from that fall. Every law, every calendar, every story of gods and stars and floods is an echo of that long unmaking. The order of heaven fell so that the order of humanity could rise, imperfect but alive, fragile but free. And maybe, in some quiet way, that was always the plan. When the rains began, no one believed they would last. The skies had darkened before, and the rivers had swelled countless times. The people of Sumer had always known the moods of water. Floods were part of the rhythm of their world, both feared and depended upon. But this time was different. The air carried a tension that could not be measured, the way the earth feels before a storm that changes everything. The first winds came low and heavy, rolling across the plains, bending the reeds, rattling the palm leaves along the riverbanks. The sound was not violent yet, only endless. And then the endlessness became the warning. The last Anunnaki king had felt it coming long before the people did. His astronomers had noted strange alignments in the heavens, configurations of stars that no longer matched the celestial order inscribed on the tablets of destiny. The constellations had shifted, slightly but unmistakably, as if the very framework of the world were turning on a new axis. The king's advisors urged him to take precautions, to build higher embankments, to fortify the granaries, but he understood it was not that kind of threat. This was not a season of rain. This was an ending wearing the disguise of a storm. The myths that survive describe it in fragments. One says that the gods, angered by humanity's noise, decided to wash the earth clean. Another speaks of the deep itself rising, as if the seas remembered an ancient grievance and came back to reclaim what had once been theirs. Still another says it was not punishment at all, but inevitability, the closing of one age and the birth of another. Whatever the cause, the signs multiplied. Animals began to move strangely, gathering on higher ground. The air thickened with salt and heat. The light of the sun dimmed as if seen through water long before the rain began to fall. The king ordered the priests to gather in the courtyard of the great temple. They lit fires in the sacred braziers and poured libations to the gods of sky and deep. The smoke rose and vanished into the heavy air. No answer came. The hymns, usually carried by the wind, seemed to fall back on themselves. The divine silence was more terrifying than thunder. For the first time in millennia, there was no response from above. He summoned the builders next. If the heavens had gone quiet, then perhaps salvation lay in human hands. The plans he gave them were strange, drawn not for a temple or city, but for something without precedent. It was not a ship in the way we understand ships. It was a vessel of survival, built not only to ride the flood, but to preserve memory. Inside it were to be stored seeds, scrolls, tablets, and instruments, the essences of knowledge and life. The king spoke not of saving people, but of saving continuity. If the world must sleep, he said, then let it dream of what it was. Days passed. Then the sky broke. It did not begin with rain, but with light, a blinding, diffuse glow that covered the horizon, followed by a roar so deep it seemed to come from inside the earth. The people fled to their roofs and hills, clutching their children, watching the rivers rise as if the ground itself were breathing. The king stood on the steps of his temple and watched the waters gather. They rose faster than any had ever seen, sweeping over fields and roads, tearing down walls and carrying them like driftwood. The city's canals overflowed and merged with the rivers until there was no distinction between land and water. Within days the flood became an ocean. The towers of Eridu disappeared beneath the grey surface. The cries of the people faded. The king's vessel, the great archive of his world, floated on a sea that stretched beyond sight, carrying within it the remnants of an age. Around it the storm continued, unending. The heavens, which had once been precise and orderly, now seemed chaotic, their stars hidden behind layers of cloud. It was as if time itself had been erased. In the myth, there is a passage where the king speaks to the wind. He tells it to carry the names of the cities that have fallen, Uruk, Lhasa, Kish, so that when the waters recede, their memory will return. He names each one aloud, slowly, as though reciting a prayer. The act of remembering becomes the only form of resistance left. And perhaps that is the reason his story survived when the others were drowned. For 40 days the storm raged. For 40 nights the king's vessel drifted in silence. Those who were with him, the scribes, the astronomers, the few who had believed his warnings, recorded nothing during that time. When they later wrote of it, their words carried the flat tone of survivors who could no longer separate fact from awe. They described lightning that seemed to burn without sound, waves that glowed from within, clouds so thick they felt solid. The line between heaven and earth was gone. There was only motion. And then, one morning, the silence came. The rain stopped. The clouds broke apart. The air was still, so still that even the survivors were afraid to breathe too loudly. The floodplain stretched endlessly around them, a mirror of the pale sky. Here and there, the tops of mountains broke the surface like the bones of the world. The king ordered a bird to be released, and it flew until it vanished, never returning. Days later, another bird came back with a branch. Small, green, impossibly alive. It was the first sign that the world had not ended, only changed. The water receded slowly, as if reluctant to leave. The vessel came to rest on the slope of a distant hill. The survivors stepped out into silence thicker than the flood had been. There was no sound of insects, no cry of birds. Even the wind seemed to have forgotten how to move. The world smelled of clay and salt. The king knelt and pressed his hand to the mud, and for a long time he said nothing. Some say he wept, not from despair, but from understanding. He knew that the old order was gone. The gods who had shaped the world had withdrawn, and their voice would never again be heard in the same way. In the days that followed, the survivors began to rebuild. They gathered stones, dug channels for water, and marked the directions of sunrise and sunset to orient themselves once more within the cosmos. They used the fragments of their old knowledge like broken maps, piecing together what remained. The me, the divine principles of civilization or Samt, had not vanished entirely. They survived in memory, in instinct, in the simple acts of building and planting. The world was emptier, but not dead. The king, though older than anyone could imagine, worked alongside them. He helped raise the first altar, a plain stone table set toward the east. He taught them the rituals of renewal, not for the gods who had gone, but for the idea of balance itself. He told them that the flood was not a punishment but a reset, a cleansing of cycles too long unbroken. The silence that followed was the world learning to breathe again. The people asked him if the gods would return. His answer was quiet. They never left, he said. They changed their faces. They are in the wind, the grain, the light. You will learn to hear them again, but not as you once did. It was not comfort in the usual sense, but it was enough. When the new settlements took shape, they were smaller, simpler. The temples were modest, their walls unadorned. The priests still sang, but their hymns were softer now, less commands and more pleas. Writing returned too, though slowly. The first tablets after the flood are different from the ones before it. The old ones were lists of decrees and measurements. The new ones are songs and prayers. It was as if the world had shifted from certainty to wonder. Knowledge had survived, but it had become humble. The silence after the flood lasted generations. Not literal silence, but a sense of absence, a gap between heaven and earth that had not existed before. The people still looked to the stars, but now they seemed farther away. The constellations that once marked the calendars of the gods now marked the years of men. The king himself, though revered, grew distant too. Some say he lived in solitude after the rebuilding began, dwelling near the mountains where his vessel had come to rest. Others claim he disappeared entirely, walking into the horizon one morning and never returning. In the centuries that followed, his name changed. Some called him Ziusudra, others Atrahasis, others Utnapishtim. Each culture adopted his story, reshaped it, softened its divine edges and made it their own. But the essence remained. A great flood, a survivor who carries knowledge, and a silence afterward that teaches humanity how to live differently. The flood became less about destruction and more about transformation. Archaeologists have found the traces of those floods, layers of silt and clay lying like fingerprints across the ruins of ancient cities. They tell of real disasters, of rivers that overflowed and civilizations forced to move. Yet even with evidence, the story holds something larger than fact. The flood in the myths is not just water, it's time itself. It is the erasure that allows remembering, the washing away of certainty so that curiosity can grow in its place. In one Babylonian tablet, the king speaks after the storm, reflecting on what remains. The waters have taken the walls, he says, but the measure of the stars endures. As long as one man can look upward, the gods are not lost. It's a simple line, almost too human for a divine king, but maybe that's the point. The flood made the gods distant, but it also made humanity self-aware. When the silence followed, it was not emptiness, but invitation. The space in which people could begin to think for themselves. The survivors passed on their memories carefully. Around new fires they told the story of the world that had drowned, not as tragedy, but as warning. Every generation added a detail, a name, a symbol. Over time, those stories grew into mythologies, religions, philosophies. They became the foundation of every later civilization that looked backward and wondered what came before. The flood was the dividing line between the age of the gods and the age of man, between command and curiosity, between perfection and possibility. Sometimes, when we imagine those survivors standing on the new earth, surrounded by silence, it's easy to think of despair. But maybe they didn't see it that way. Maybe for the first time they felt ownership of the world. Without the gods directing every rhythm, they had to listen for the patterns themselves. The flood took away certainty but left behind freedom, a fragile, precious thing that would become the heart of every story told since. If you close your eyes and think of that moment, you can almost feel it. The weight of water lifting, the first breath of dry air, the smell of new soil, and the dizzying quiet after chaos. That silence is not absence. It's potential. It's the pause before the next sentence of history begins. The king's vessel, according to legend, remained where it landed, high above the plain. Some said it turned to stone, others that it sank into the earth, becoming the foundation of a new temple. Pilgrims searched for it for centuries, believing it held the last unbroken record of the old world, the blueprint of what once was. Maybe it does, or maybe the real vessel was never made of wood or stone at all, but of memory itself. Every retelling, every fragment of song or prayer is part of that same arc, carrying the essence of the world that came before through the flood of time. The silence that followed the great flood was long, but it was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of remembering, the slow realization that even when the gods are gone, their order can be rebuilt, not through obedience but through understanding. The flood washed the world clean, but the memory of the divine never left. It simply became quieter, folded into the rhythm of the wind, the pulse of the rivers, the turn of the stars. And so the world began again, smaller and more fragile, but alive. The old gods had withdrawn, but their patterns lingered in everything that moved. The king was gone, but his teaching survived, carried in whispers and in clay, waiting for new hands to uncover them thousands of years later. The flood had not destroyed civilization, it had replanted it. And the silence that followed was the sound of the earth catching its breath before the next age began. When the waters finally withdrew, the earth seemed unfamiliar. The fields were gone, the temples erased, the old roads lost beneath layers of silt and salt. The few survivors who stepped out onto that reshaped world found themselves without reference points. There were no boundaries, no cities, no altars to remind them who they had been. The silence that followed the flood was not just the absence of sound, it was the loss of certainty. The people who remained began to drift, searching for dry ground, for patterns that resembled the world they once knew. Yet there was one figure who did not drift, one who could not. The last Anunnaki king had watched the flood come, had heard the voices of the gods fall silent, and had seen the temples disappear beneath the waves. But when the waters receded, he did not ascend to the heavens as some legends claimed, nor did he vanish into myth immediately. He stayed. He walked the mud flats where his cities had been, his robes heavy with salt, his sandals sinking into what had once been roads and markets and courtyards. The people who followed him at a distance saw him move through the ruins as if listening to something beneath the surface. They whispered that he was speaking to the earth, asking it to remember its old form. In the stories written long after his reign, he's described as both ageless and weary. His eyes, they said, had seen too much. Not only the destruction of his world, but also its potential for rebirth. While others took the flood as a sign that the gods had abandoned them, he saw it differently. To him, it was a cycle, the inevitable turning of time that even divine power could not halt. Yet he could not bring himself to leave. Perhaps it was duty, or sorrow, or simply the refusal of memory to die. Whatever it was, the king who had ruled for thousands of years remained among the ruins of the first civilization, long after the last of his people had gone to build new homes in distant lands. Those who passed through the empty plains told stories of seeing him at dusk standing alone on the steps of what had once been the great temple of Eridu, his face turned toward the stars that had returned to their places in the sky. Sometimes he would lift his hands as if measuring the constellations, tracing their angles against the horizon. He no longer prayed to them. He was studying them, quietly, like an old scholar confirming that the order he once preserved still existed, even if only faintly. In those years after the flood, the land began to heal. New reeds grew along the rivers, fish returned to the shallows, and the soil hardened enough for small crops to sprout again. The survivors who wandered back built small shelters and planted seeds from the stores the king had preserved before the deluge. They worked in silence, aware that something vast had ended but unable to name it. Each night, smoke from their fires rose into a sky that was both new and ancient, and the king watched it, seeing in the thin columns of ash a reflection of the prayers once offered in golden temples. He could have left, perhaps. The myths say that the gods offered him a place among them, immortality, a seat in the celestial assembly, freedom from the weariness of the mortal world. But he declined. The heavens have their order, he's said to have told the messenger, and the earth needs one too. He chose to stay where the divine had withdrawn, to serve as the bridge that would keep their memory alive. It was not rebellion, it was stewardship. The king understood that if the gods truly wished to abandon the world, their order would vanish completely. Yet the stars still shone, the rivers still flowed, and the laws of nature still held. That meant something remained. That meant the work was not finished. The people who found him after the flood no longer recognized him as a king. His court was gone, his crown lost to the water, his robes torn and patched. They called him the old man of the plain. He spoke little, though his presence carried the weight of both authority and calm. When asked why he stayed, he would answer only, "Because the world still listens." Those who lingered in his company noticed that the birds seemed to settle closer when he was near, that the wind softened, that even the air carried a faint warmth. Whether that was truth or reverence, no one could tell. Over time, a small settlement formed around him. Not a city, not even a village, just a gathering of those who sought the comfort of order in a world that had none. He taught them the old ways, though gently, without the rigidity of divine command. He showed them how to mark the solstice, how to track the moon, how to read the sky not as prophecy but as rhythm. He told them stories of the gods, not as rulers but as teachers, beings who had once walked beside humanity to show it the meaning of balance. His words were quiet, often ending in long pauses that left the room for thought. It was said that one night, when the air was clear and the stars sharp against the black sky, a group of travellers arrived, survivors from distant lands who had heard of the old man who remembered the gods. They brought with them clay tablets, water-stained but still legible, fragments of songs and maps rescued from their own drowned cities. The king received them and spread their fragments before him in the light of an oil lamp. For hours he traced the faded markings with his fingers, reading them in silence. Then he smiled. "It is enough," he said. "The pattern survives." In that moment, the stories say, the king realized that his task had changed. He was no longer a ruler of men or a mediator of gods. He had become something else, a keeper of memory. His kingdom was now the fragile continuity between what had been and what might be again. He began to teach his followers how to write anew, how to shape symbols that could carry ideas across generations. He told them that the clay beneath their feet was more enduring than stone, that the act of writing was the closest thing left to creation. The first scribes of the post-flood world learned from him, and through them, the art of writing, the art of remembering, was born again. But the king himself grew quieter. The people noticed that he spent more time alone, walking to the riverbanks at dawn, standing motionless for hours as if listening for a sound that never came. Some said he was waiting for the gods to speak again. Others believed he was simply making peace with silence. He began to write less and speak even less than that. Yet when he did, his words carried a strange clarity, as though they came from somewhere beyond language. "You must not look for the gods where they were," he told one of his pupils. "You must look for them where they will be." The years passed, though none could say how many. The king no longer seemed to age, or perhaps he aged beyond recognition. His followers built a small temple in his honour, not grand like those of the old cities, but simple. 4 stone pillars and a roof of reeds. They placed no idols inside, only a bowl of water that reflected the sky. "This," the king told them, "is what remains of heaven on earth." He would sit before that bowl for hours, watching the reflection of the stars ripple with the wind. There are stories, always stories, of what happened next. Some say that one morning he was gone, his footprints leading into the desert, fading into the sand. Others claim he lay down beside the river, closed his eyes, and simply became part of the earth. One version, more poetic than believable, insists that he walked into the water at sunset and the surface did not break. Whatever the truth, when his followers went to find him, they discovered only his staff, driven upright into the soil, and beside it a small clay tablet, inscribed with words that none of them had seen before. When those words were later translated by the next generation of scribes, they were simple. "The world remembers." Nothing more. No farewell, no command. Just that quiet affirmation, as if to say that the act of remembrance itself was enough to keep the divine alive. Centuries passed. The small settlement grew into a town, then into a city. Its name changed with time, its people withered and multiplied, but the story of the old man of the plain endured. Every generation retold it differently. Sometimes he was a god who stayed behind out of love, sometimes a king cursed to wander until the end of days, sometimes a prophet who refused immortality. But in each version, the meaning was the same, that there was one among the ancients who could not bear to abandon the world, who believed that even in ruin the earth deserved witness. When archaeologists uncovered the oldest strata of Sumer thousands of years later, they found, among the usual layers of pottery and ash, a few strange anomalies. Inscriptions older than they should have been, written in a style that seemed transitional, neither pre-flood nor fully post-flood. One fragment in particular puzzled them, a single line written in archaic cuneiform that read, "He stayed to measure the silence." They debated its meaning endlessly, but perhaps it was never meant to be solved. Perhaps it was only meant to be heard. In a way, the king who refused to leave never truly did. His presence lingered in every act of rebuilding, in every effort to restore order after chaos. The concept of kingship itself, the idea that rulers are not owners but caretakers, is his legacy. Every civilization that rose afterward carried some echo of his example, that leadership is not domination, but endurance. The memory of balance, the willingness to remain when others flee, those are the traits that define his myth. Even now, when people look at the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, the buried temples, the broken walls, the fragments of clay that still bear human fingerprints, there is something hauntingly alive in them. They feel less like remnants and more like pauses in an ongoing story. Perhaps that's what the king understood. The world doesn't end in floods or fire or silence. It ends only when it is forgotten. And as long as someone remains to bear witness, even if that someone is only a story, the world continues. Maybe that is why his legend endures when so many others have faded. He represents not the power of gods or the splendour of golden cities, but the quiet, stubborn act of staying, of refusing to let memory die, of standing on ruined ground and choosing to believe that the earth will remember what it once was. And in that sense, he still hasn't left. His story, carried across languages and centuries, is the proof that he succeeded. The flood came and went. The silence deepened and then softened. Civilizations rose, fell, and were buried. But his presence persists, not in stone, not in temples, but in the fragile continuity of memory that connects us to a time when gods walked beside men, and one king chose to remain after even they had gone. If you stand in the plains where the Tigris and Euphrates once met, you can still feel it in the air, that faint, unspoken steadiness that seems to hum beneath the wind. It's not superstition or magic, it's continuity. It's the echo of the king who refused to leave, reminding the world that endings are only another form of patience. The gods may have departed, but he stayed, and in staying he gave the world time enough to begin again. In the generations that followed the flood, the world was quieter, as if sound itself had to learn how to travel again. The wind moved differently over the new plains, and the rivers carved new paths through the softened earth. Where cities once glittered with firelight and gold, now only fields stretched into the distance. The survivors were scattered, small groups wandering across the vast altered landscape, drawn by the memory of where water and land once met. They carried little with them: fragments of stories, a few tools, handfuls of seed wrapped in cloth, and the conviction that they had to rebuild something, even if they no longer remembered exactly what it had been. Those first generations after the flood lived between remembering and forgetting. They knew the world had changed, that the gods who once ruled beside men were gone, and yet they couldn't quite let go of the patterns that had defined their lives. They built small shelters where the old temples had stood, not out of reverence, but habit, as though their hands remembered something their minds had lost. They planted in the same rhythms their ancestors had used, marking the seasons by the stars, even though the sky itself seemed subtly rearranged. They whispered the old names, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, softly, uncertain whether those names still had power. But even in their uncertainty, they were rebuilding. Among them were those who had been closest to the last Anunnaki King, the ones he had taught before disappearing into legend. They remembered his instructions, to record, to measure, to teach, and above all to remember. They became the first generation of the builders of memory, men and women who understood that the flood had not erased the world, only wiped its surface clean. The lines of the old civilization were still beneath the mud, waiting to be redrawn. It would take patience and generations of repetition, but the memory would return. They began with stories. Around the first fires of the new world, they spoke of the age before the flood, of the gods who walked the earth, of the king who had stayed behind, of the great waters that had swallowed everything. These stories were not told as myths, but as lessons, explanations for why the world now felt emptier, and yet more their own. Children learned them by heart, repeating the names of places that no longer existed, learning the patterns of a cosmos they would never see but could still imagine. In time, the stories began to shape the rebuilding. The first permanent settlements rose where memory was strongest, along the old riverbanks, near the remnants of temples that had not been completely erased. The survivors did not rebuild the great ziggurats of before. They built smaller shrines instead, made of mud, brick and timber. Inside, they placed no statues, only carved stones or simple offerings. The gods were gone, but the idea of connection remained. They no longer expected answers from heaven. They built to remind themselves of the question. The builders of memory were not priests, not in the old sense. They were scribes, observers, and keepers of order. They watched the movements of the stars, the swelling and receding of rivers, the cycles of wind and rain. Slowly they began to write again, simple marks at first, signs of grain and trade, then of language itself. Each new sign they pressed into clay was a fragment of the world they were rebuilding. They didn't know it, but they were creating the foundations of history, the first attempt to make time visible. One of the oldest surviving inscriptions from that period reads, "The waters rose, but the measure remained." It's a small line, carved onto a fragment of pottery found near what used to be Eridu, and it carries the quiet determination of people who refuse to let memory die. For them, the act of writing was not about communication alone. It was resistance against forgetting. The flood had taught them that knowledge could vanish overnight. To write was to fix a thought in place, to anchor it so the next generation could find it again. The descendants of the king's followers travelled far. Some went north, into the lands that would later become Akkad and Babylon. Others moved east, into the valleys that fed the mountains. Wherever they went, they carried fragments of the old wisdom, the geometry of temples, the mathematics of irrigation, the alignment of stars to seasons. Over centuries, those fragments evolved into new cultures, new languages, new gods. But beneath each was the same quiet inheritance, the belief that order could be built, that knowledge could restore balance to the world. Archaeologists can still trace the fingerprints of those first builders. The earliest villages that appeared after the flood all share a curious precision. Their streets align with the cardinal directions. Their walls follow proportions far too deliberate to be random. Even when the materials are crude, the planning is exact. These were not accidental settlements. They were experiments in remembrance, attempts to rebuild the pattern of the world as it had been when heaven and earth were one. The builders of memory did not work for glory. Most of their names were never recorded. They were quiet people. Farmers who measured the seasons by the stars, craftsmen who shaped bricks in familiar ratios, storytellers who wove cosmology into lullabies. Yet it was through their patience that civilization returned. The great cities of Sumer, Uruk, Lagash, were not miracles of invention. They were the culmination of thousands of years of remembering. When the first temple of the New Age was completed, it was smaller than any of the pre-flood structures, but those who built it said the air felt the same, a stillness that carried both reverence and relief. The priests who later occupied it were not the servants of divine masters, but caretakers of the world's rhythm. They kept calendars, maintained the canals, and preserved records of births, deaths, and harvests. In a sense, they continued the work of the king who had refused to leave, maintaining balance, one calculation at a time. As the centuries passed, the stories changed. The gods who had once been teachers became legends. The king who had remained became a mythic ancestor, a symbol of endurance. But the builders of memory never forgot their purpose. In their libraries, they collected tablets from across generations, copying and recopying them, even when the meaning of the oldest texts had become obscure. To them, it didn't matter if they understood every word. Preservation itself was sacred. To forget was to lose the world again. Sometimes, when reading those ancient tablets today, you can almost hear their intention. The language is practical. Lists of supplies, records of grain, accounts of trade. But between the lines there's a pattern of reverence. The precision of their numbers, the care in their handwriting, the repetition of formulas all suggest something more than administration. They were recording not just transactions, but existence itself. Each mark was a quiet declaration, the world continues. And yet, even as new cities rose, the memory of the flood remained close. Every river, Every heavy rain carried the weight of that ancient fear. The builders of memory lived with a kind of inherited caution, as though they knew that order was always temporary. Their architecture reflected it, designed to endure, but also to be rebuilt quickly if needed. Even their myths carried this awareness. They told of cycles, of destruction and renewal, of gods who died and returned, of kings who vanished and reappeared. History to them was not a line but a tide. In the ruins of one early city, archaeologists discovered a series of clay plaques buried beneath the foundation of a temple. Each one contained a single sentence, different from the others, written in careful cuneiform. Together they formed something like a poem, though it was never meant to be spoken aloud. It read, "The gods left their measure in our hands. The flood took their voices but not their rhythm. We build because the world remembers us through walls." It is the oldest known declaration of purpose by any civilization, and it tells us everything about how the survivors saw themselves, not as inventors, but as inheritors of something sacred and ongoing. As the generations passed, memory began to take physical form. The ziggurat returned, not as the dwelling of gods, but as the axis of the human world. A mountain built from the ground up instead of descending from heaven. Each layer represented a stage of ascent, from earth to sky, from ignorance to understanding. At its summit, priests observed the heavens, not to hear divine commands, but to record their movement. The sky had become a book, and the builders of memory were learning to read it. That shift changed everything. Knowledge was no longer the privilege of the gods, it was something humans could earn. The same hands that shaped bricks could now measure stars. The same voices that once prayed could now calculate. The flood had separated heaven and earth, but the survivors had built a bridge of understanding between them. It was fragile, yes, but real. The world had become, at last, a partnership between curiosity and remembrance. The builders of memory would not have thought of themselves as philosophers or scientists, but that is what they became. They studied the flow of water to understand irrigation. They measured shadows to divide the day. They tracked the moon's phases and named them, creating the first calendars. Each discovery was a rediscovery, an echo of knowledge once held by gods and kings. But now it belonged to everyone who could learn it. The divine had become collective. Sometimes in the tablets you find traces of personal reflection, small lines scribbled in the margins by scribes who could not resist the human urge to comment. "The stars return as they always have," one wrote, "but I am still new." It's a small thought, but it captures the essence of that era. The awareness that the world endures even when civilizations don't, and that each generation must relearn what the last one knew. The builders of memory understood that truth instinctively. That was their strength. The flood had stripped away the grandeur of the old world, but in its place, it gave humanity something deeper: humility. The survivors no longer saw themselves as servants of gods or masters of nature. They saw themselves as participants in a vast, delicate pattern. To build was to contribute, not to dominate. To remember was to preserve, not to control. And through that quiet philosophy, they laid the foundation for every civilization that followed. In time, the builders' descendants would call themselves Sumerians, then Akkadians, then Babylonians, each layer of culture resting atop the last like the sediment of the flood itself. They would invent writing anew, refine mathematics, chart constellations, and write down the stories of gods and kings in forms that would survive thousands of years. But beneath every innovation, the same impulse endured: the need to remember what was lost, and the need to make meaning of what survived. The flood had washed away a world where gods ruled beside men. In its place, humanity learned how to rule itself, not perfectly, not without error, but with memory as its guide. The builders of memory, those quiet figures moving through the dawn of the new age, never sought monuments. Their monuments were time itself, the continuity of thought, the persistence of learning, the refusal to let silence erase the past. If you could step back into that world, you would see no grand spectacle, no miracles. You would see people kneeling in the mud, shaping bricks with bare hands, pressing tiny marks into wet clay, aligning a doorway with the morning sun, teaching a child the names of stars, ordinary acts, repeated endlessly. And yet those acts are the reason the world remembered. The builders of memory were the invisible architects of civilization, not kings or warriors, but keepers of the pattern, reassembling eternity one line, one story, one generation at a time. And perhaps that is the quiet truth hidden beneath all the grand myths and golden ages. The survival of knowledge is not the work of gods, it is the work of hands. The flood ended an age of perfection, but it gave birth to endurance, the slow, unglamorous determination to rebuild again and again for as long as the world allows. When the winds move across the plains of southern Mesopotamia today, they still uncover fragments of those first tablets, pieces of clay once held by those early scribes. If you hold one up to the light, you can still see the faint impression of a thumbprint. The builder of memory who pressed it into shape thousands of years ago would not have thought of himself as leaving a mark for eternity. He was just recording a measure of grain, a tally of water, a line of language. And yet, through that act he became part of something eternal. The gods may have written the tablets of destiny, but it was humanity that learned to write history. The flood washed away the cities, but it could not drown the impulse to remember. That is how the world began again, not with a divine command, but with quiet hands rebuilding what time had tried to erase. And somewhere, beyond the noise of ages, the king who refused to leave would have recognized it as the fulfillment of his final hope, that the world, even without gods, would find a way to remember itself. Long after the floodwaters had settled and the first generations of survivors had built their villages, the earth began to close over the past. The mud hardened, the reeds grew thick along the rivers, and the ruins of the old world disappeared beneath layers of time. The people who walked the plains of Mesopotamia no longer saw the outlines of the drowned cities. To them, the land was simply the land. Fertile, vast, unremarkable. The flood had given them new soil to till, but beneath their feet lay the bones of an age that still breathed faintly through the clay. At first, they did not know what they were uncovering. A farmer might find a shard of carved stone while digging for water. A shepherd might notice a mound that looked too symmetrical to be natural. Children played on hills that were not hills at all, but the buried tops of temples. And then, as people began to settle and dig deeper, they found the first tablets. Hardened by time, marked with tiny, deliberate symbols, they emerged from the soil like whispers from the dead. No one could read them anymore. The language that had once connected heaven and earth was gone. But the presence of the tablets themselves, their weight, their strangeness, stirred something in those who found them. It was as if the earth had remembered what people had forgotten. Generations later, as the new cities of Uruk and Lagash rose along the rivers, curiosity turned to reverence. The old artifacts were no longer seen as remnants of a lost age, but as sacred relics. The people called them the stones of the gods. Priests stored them in temples, believing they were messages left by divine hands. They didn't know that they were holding the archives of their own ancestors, that the gods who had written those symbols were human. Still, in a way, their reverence was not misplaced. Those tablets did contain the remnants of divine order, not because the gods had written them, but because humanity had once believed enough to preserve them. Each new generation built its temples atop the ruins of the old. They used the broken stones as foundations, not realizing that they were rebuilding the same designs that had existed long before their time. The dimensions of the ziggurats, the alignment of walls with the stars, the ratio of stairs to height, all of it mirrored patterns first established before the flood. The builders didn't know why those proportions felt right. They only knew that they did. The knowledge had seeped into instinct, carried by repetition, embedded in the culture like a memory passed down through the hands. It was during one such rebuilding, centuries after the flood, that a discovery was made that changed everything. Workers in the city of Nippur were laying the foundation for a new temple when they struck something solid beneath the soil. What they found was not stone but a massive slab of black clay, carved on both sides with lines of text unlike anything known at the time. The priests took it to their scholars, who spent months studying the marks. Slowly, painfully, they began to recognize patterns. Some of the signs matched the script they used for trade and record keeping, but others were older, unfamiliar, more intricate. It was as if the tablet spoke two languages at once, one human, one divine. They named it the Record of Kings. The text, once deciphered, told of rulers who had reigned for thousands of years, men who had walked with the gods, who had governed cities that no longer existed, who had witnessed the coming of the Great Flood. It was the first rediscovery of the forgotten world. The priests who read it were astonished. The story it told stretched backward, beyond memory, beyond reason. It said that kingship had descended from heaven, that the gods themselves had established the first order of the rule. It spoke of Eridu, the city of beginnings, and of a king whose reign had lasted 13,000 years. No one could comprehend such numbers. To the people of that time, a single lifetime was long enough to see empires rise and fall. The idea of a ruler who spanned millennia seemed impossible, and yet the text was too deliberate to dismiss. It was not a myth, it was a record. The priests debated endlessly. Were these real kings, or symbols of something greater? Some insisted that the numbers were not years, but cycles of the stars, a celestial calendar disguised as history. Others believed that the ancients had lived in a world where time moved differently, where the boundaries between mortal and divine were blurred. The arguments never resolved, and perhaps they weren't meant to. The tablet's purpose was not to explain, but to remind. The discovery spread quickly. Other temples began to dig, searching for more. They found fragments, broken tablets, inscribed stones, half-erased names. Slowly the picture grew. Beneath the cities of the living lay the ghost of another civilization, one older, quieter, and far more advanced than anyone had imagined. The priests declared that they had uncovered the age before the flood, the time of the Anunnaki. And from that point on, the world no longer felt young. As the archive expanded, so did the questions. Some of the tablets described technologies that no one could understand, metals that could not rust, lights that needed no flame, instruments that measured the sky with impossible accuracy. Others spoke of the laws of heaven and earth, of the me, the divine decrees that governed existence. Scholars copied these texts endlessly, trying to translate them into their own time, but much was already lost. The meaning of certain symbols had faded. The logic of the old world no longer applied. The survivors' descendants could preserve the form, but not the essence. Still, even fragments had power. The myths that arose from those rediscovered tablets became the foundation of Mesopotamian religion. The gods of the Anunnaki became the gods of Sumer. The king who had stayed behind became a bridge between eras, his story reshaped but never erased. The people no longer remembered him as a man who had refused to leave, but as a demigod who had survived the flood through divine favour. In that transformation, something curious happened. History became myth, and myth became memory's most enduring vessel. Centuries passed. Each time a new city was built, its scribes added their own interpretations to the ancient texts. The story grew longer, richer, less literal. The names changed, but the structure remained. Always there was a beginning in heaven, a descent of kingship, a golden age, a fall and a flood. The cycle repeated itself in myth as it once had in reality. By then, few believed the old tablets were factual, but belief wasn't necessary. Their existence was enough to remind people that they were part of something vast, a pattern written not just in words, but in the stones themselves. What the priest could not have known was that beneath the layers they uncovered, even deeper still, older secrets waited. In some of the lowest strata, the oldest levels of the cities, archaeologists in modern times have found artifacts that defy simple classification. Stones cut with precision beyond what their tools should have allowed, patterns that correspond to star alignments not visible from Mesopotamia, alloys that seem out of place by thousands of years. These are the faint, stubborn traces of a lost order, the material remnants of the age of the Anunnaki perhaps, or of those who remembered them. The question of how much of that ancient knowledge survived remains open. The Sumerians themselves claimed that their wisdom came from the gods, from the deep past. They said the me, the divine laws of civilization, were given to them, not invented. Their system of writing appeared suddenly, fully formed. Their mathematics, based on 60, mirrored celestial cycles. Their architecture followed proportions that reflected astronomical constants. None of it seems accidental, and yet, when asked where this knowledge came from, their texts always gave the same answer: from before the flood, from those who came before. The secrets buried in stone and clay are not just physical, they are philosophical. They show how a civilization saw itself, as a continuation, not an origin. Every discovery they made, every structure they built, every tablet they inscribed was framed as a restoration of what once was. The Sumerians did not believe they were creating a new world. They believed they were remembering the old one. To them, knowledge was not invention, but recovery. The past was not gone. It was merely hidden, waiting to be uncovered. And perhaps that is why their civilization endured for so long. They did not see history as progress, but as return. Each generation was a guardian of the pattern, not its author. The great library at Nippur, the archives of Ur, the temple schools of Uruk, all were built with the same purpose: to protect what the flood had nearly erased. Their scribes copied ancient texts with obsessive precision, even when they no longer understood their meaning. They were preserving rhythm, not comprehension. It was faith of a different kind, faith in continuity. Modern scholars often marvel at how little the Sumerians changed over the centuries, how their art, language, and rituals remained consistent for millennia. To us it seems static. To them it was sacred. Change was disorder. Memory was perfection. The closer they came to reproducing the old world, the more stable the new one became. The flood had taught them that forgetting was the greatest danger. Every wall, every tablet, every ceremony was a safeguard against that. Yet, even in their devotion to memory, they couldn't avoid transformation. The act of remembering reshaped the past just as surely as it preserved it. Each copy introduced small variations, each interpretation a new nuance. Over time, the myths of the gods grew more human, the stories of kings more symbolic. The Anunnaki became archetypes of creation, order, rebellion, and wisdom. The king became the eternal bridge between mortality and the divine. What began as history evolved into myth because myth was more enduring. Stone erodes, clay breaks. But a story, once told, survives in the mind. Today, when we study the tablets in museums, the ones retrieved from beneath centuries of dust, we're reading the handwriting of people who were themselves trying to read the past. Their work was already an interpretation of an interpretation, and yet, through all those layers, the same pulse remains. The quiet insistence that the world once held a greater harmony, and that fragments of it still lie buried, waiting to be understood. Archaeologists continue to unearth those fragments. Foundations of forgotten cities, seals bearing symbols older than any known language, stones aligned to the movements of stars no longer visible. Each discovery adds to the same story the king began to write long ago, that the earth remembers. Every tablet is a conversation across time, every inscription a breath drawn from the silence of ages. Perhaps that is the real secret buried in stone and clay, not the hidden technology of the gods, not the proof of lost civilizations, but the simple fact that memory itself is indestructible. It changes form, yes, but it never truly disappears. The flood buried the cities, but not the impulse to record. The silence erased the voices, but not the will to speak again. Every mark pressed into wet clay was a defiance against oblivion. If you stand in the ruins of Ur today, the heat rising from the desert floor, the wind carrying the smell of dust and salt, you can still feel that defiance. The ground beneath your feet holds more history than you could ever uncover. Each grain of sand is a fragment of a wall, each shard of pottery a word from a forgotten sentence. The secrets buried there are not waiting to be revealed. They are waiting to be remembered by anyone willing to listen to what silence still holds. In that sense, the flood never truly ended. It continues, not as water, but as time, the slow, relentless tide that covers everything we build. And yet, just as the first survivors rose after the deluge to rebuild the world, we too dig through the layers, uncovering the echoes of what came before. The story repeats itself endlessly. The world forgets. The world remembers. The world forgets again. And through it all the pattern remains, carved into the clay beneath our feet. The secrets buried in stone and clay are not mysteries to be solved, but invitations, reminders that history is not behind us but beneath us, that every discovery is a rediscovery, that every civilization carries within it the memory of the one that came before. The gods may have written the first lines, but it is humanity that continues the story, pressing new words into the same eternal earth. As the cities of Sumer began to rise again, carrying within their walls the memory of the world before the flood, a quiet transformation was already taking place far beyond the rivers, across deserts and mountains. Beyond the horizon known to the scribes of Mesopotamia, other people were building, dreaming, and recording their own beginnings. None of them knew that they were continuing the same pattern. None could have imagined that the echoes of the sky gods, the ones who had walked beside the Anunnaki King, were whispering in languages they had never heard. Yet somehow the rhythm was spreading. The Sumerians had believed that kingship descended from heaven, and that civilization itself was a gift from the gods who came down to shape order out of chaos. To them, their cities were the centre of that divine geometry. But as generations passed and memories blurred, the stories travelled, carried by traders, wanderers, and exiles who left the floodplains and settled in lands untouched by the old waters. They brought with them fragments of story, of belief, of symbols that had once belonged to a single world. And in distant lands, those fragments took root in new soil. In the valleys of Egypt, people were already raising stone monuments toward the sky. They did not speak of the Anunnaki by name, but their myths carried the same pattern. Gods who descended from the stars, who taught humanity the arts of building, farming, and calculation. Their god of wisdom, Thoth, was said to have written the laws of the cosmos, just as Enki had done in Sumer. Their god of kingship, Horus, was born of heaven and earth, his reign continuing the order established in a time before the flood. The Egyptians called that era Zep Tepi, the first time, when gods ruled among men. It was a mirror of Sumer's first kingdom of endless years. The language was different, but the idea was the same, that civilization was inherited, not invented. The great stone pyramids that rose on the Nile were built to embody that inheritance. Their proportions, their alignments, their astonishing precision all seemed to echo something older than the culture that built them. The angles of their sides match celestial constants. Their placement mirrors the stars of Orion's belt, a constellation sacred to the god who bridged the world of the living and the divine. In Sumer, the same stars were known as the three stars of heaven, symbols of the gods Anu, Enlil, and Enki. The pattern reappeared in two civilizations separated by hundreds of miles and different tongues, yet united by the same silent geometry. To the Egyptians, the pyramids were not tombs alone. They were vessels of memory, stairways to the heavens, monuments built not merely to preserve bodies, but to preserve alignment between earth, stars, and time. The priests who guarded them believed that by maintaining those alignments, the balance of the cosmos itself would continue. It was the same duty the Sumerian king had once fulfilled, transposed into a different land under a different sky. The form had changed, but the purpose remained. The gods might have withdrawn, but their architecture endured. Far to the east, in the valleys that would one day become the cradle of the Indus civilization, another echo appeared. The people there built their cities with astonishing precision. Straight avenues, standardized bricks, drainage systems aligned to the cardinal directions. They had no temples, no palaces, no obvious gods carved in stone, but their order spoke of something sacred in structure itself. Their symbols, scratched onto clay seals, bear a curious resemblance to those of the earlier Sumerian pictographs. Not identical, but related, as if both had evolved from a forgotten common source. And among their myths, passed down in later Vedic hymns, there were stories of beings who came from the heavens, of cosmic architects who designed the world according to divine law. The names were different, but the message was the same. The builders of the Indus, like the scribes of Sumer, saw structure as the language of the gods. To the west, across the Mediterranean, the same story was taking new shape. The Greeks would later tell of the Titan Prometheus, who stole fire from the heavens to give to mankind. Fire, to them, meant not only warmth, but knowledge. The light of understanding, the spark of civilization. It was the same tale the Sumerians had told of the king who defied the gods by teaching forbidden wisdom to his people. In both stories, enlightenment carried a price. The gift of knowledge severed the old harmony between heaven and earth, yet it was also the beginning of human progress. The myth changed its clothes, but its heart remained unchanged. There had been a time when God shared the world with men, and the memory of that time was both blessing and burden. Even across the oceans, in lands the Sumerians never knew existed, the pattern repeated. In the high plateaus of South America, the people of the Andes would one day tell of Viracocha, the white-robed god who came from the sea to bring knowledge, laws, and order to humankind. He taught them to build with stone, to cultivate the land, to understand the heavens. When his work was done, he departed, promising to return. The same story appears among the Maya and the Aztec. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, a being of the sky who descended to teach wisdom and peace. In every version, the same elements reappear: descent, teaching, withdrawal, promise. The rhythm of divine intervention and departure is universal. How such echoes travelled is still unknown. The distance between these civilizations is immense, their languages unrelated, their timelines separated by millennia. And yet, the same motifs, gods from the sky, ancient floods, lost ages of peace, are everywhere. It's as if the memory of that first order, the reign of the Anunnaki and their king, had scattered like seeds in the floodwaters, carried across continents, germinating wherever humanity was ready to listen. Some archaeologists call it coincidence, the convergence of human imagination around the same archetypes. Others suspect cultural diffusion, stories carried along ancient trade routes, evolving as they moved. But there's another possibility, quieter and more unsettling, that the memory itself is older than any civilization, that it lives in the collective mind of humanity, passed down not through migration or trade, but through remembrance embedded in myth. If the flood washed away the world, perhaps memory was the one thing it could not drown. When the first astronomers of Egypt and Sumer recorded the stars, they did so not merely to navigate the night, but to reconstruct the order of the heavens as they believed it once was. Across cultures, the same constellations held the same meanings. Orion as the hunter or the ruler, the Pleiades as the seven sisters or judges, the Milky Way as the river of souls. Even when the stories diverged, the symbols remained. The stars became the universal script. the sky the shared text of human memory. The gods might have departed from the earth, but their reflections still shone above it. It's easy now, thousands of years later, to forget how small the world must have felt to those early civilizations, and how enormous the heavens must have seemed. They saw in the stars the remnants of a divine order that once governed everything. To them, the constellations were not random points of light. They were a language, the same one inscribed on the tablets of destiny. Each culture read it differently, but all understood that it meant the same thing. There was a pattern to existence, and humanity's role was to remember it. In Mesopotamia, the scribes drew star maps on clay, aligning the movement of Jupiter and Venus with the cycles of their gods. In Egypt, priests climbed to the tops of temples to mark the rising of Sirius, whose annual return signalled the flooding of the Nile, a new echo of the cosmic flood. In Mesoamerica, the Maya built their pyramids so that light and shadow played across them at specific times of year, reenacting the descent of their sky deity. Across every landscape, the same ritual unfolded, humanity looking upward, tracing invisible lines, searching for connection. And perhaps that is the most enduring echo of all, not the myths of gods or the ruins of temples, but the act of looking up itself. Somewhere in the deep memory of our species, the idea persists that the answers once came from above. That long before writing, before kings, before measured time, there was communication between earth and sky. The Anunnaki called it kingship. The Egyptians called it divine order. The Greeks called it the harmony of the spheres. The Maya called it the dance of the gods. The names changed, but the posture remained. Faces lifted, eyes reflecting starlight, minds reaching beyond what was visible. The last Anunnaki king had once stood beneath that same sky, measuring its rhythm, keeping its order. When the flood came, he told his people to remember the stars, to mark them, to align their buildings and rituals to their movement. Perhaps he knew that even when the earth forgets, the heavens do not. Every night they repeat the same script, slow and constant, their precision mocking the chaos below. The civilizations that rose after him, across oceans and deserts, all read that same script, even if they didn't know whose handwriting it was. When you trace the alignments of ancient monuments across the world, the connections multiply. The pyramids of Giza, the ziggurats of Sumer, the temples of Teotihuacan, the stone circles of Britain, the observatories of Peru, all seem to align with the same celestial coordinates. They point to solstices, to equinoxes, to stars that marked sacred times thousands of years before their builders were born. Coincidence, perhaps, or perhaps these were the echoes of an inherited pattern, fragments of the old cosmic architecture, remembered imperfectly but repeated faithfully. Even now our cities still follow those same principles. Our calendars still depend on the movement of the sun and moon. Our time is still measured by the turning of the heavens. The difference is only that we no longer call it divine. But in practice, we are still following the order set by the sky gods. We build our civilizations beneath their patterns, mark our seasons by their return, and find comfort in the idea that something above us remains constant. The echoes of the sky gods are everywhere. In the myths we tell, in the structures we inherit, in the quiet sense that our beginnings were not our own. They are not proof of divine intervention so much as evidence of continuity. The world we inhabit is layered with memory, and every civilization, knowingly or not, contributes another verse to the same ancient hymn. The gods may have vanished from sight, but their rhythm persists in the architecture of the world itself. And perhaps that was the intention all along. The king who refused to leave had said that the world remembers. Maybe he understood that the real immortality of the divine was not in temples or tablets, but in imitation. That as long as humans continued to build, align, measure and tell stories, the essence of the old order would never die. The flood had destroyed the kingdom, but its echoes spread across the planet, carried in the geometry of monuments, in the mathematics of calendars, in the constancy of the stars. If you stand in any ancient site, Giza at dawn, Machu Picchu at dusk, Stonehenge in midsummer light, you feel it immediately. The air is still, the stones are silent, yet there's a sense of awareness in the way they stand, as if they are remembering something older than themselves. That silence is not emptiness, it is continuity, the same stillness that once filled the temple courtyards of Sumer when the king stood before the altar, reading the heavens. The echoes of the sky gods have never faded completely. They are in the myths we call creation, in the sciences we call discovery, in the instinct that drives us to look upward and wonder where we came from. The Anunnaki may be gone, but their memory survives in every culture that ever sought to mirror the heavens on earth. The flood separated heaven from the world, but the echoes bridged it again. The pattern remains, soft, unbroken, patient, carried in stone, in story, in the night sky itself. For thousands of years after the flood, the world drifted through cycles of remembering and forgetting. Civilizations rose, each believing itself to be the first. New kings built their monuments upon old foundations. New scribes pressed their marks over faded symbols. New priests declared their revelations while standing in the shadows of ancient truths. The memory of the sky gods had become myth, their order transformed into legend. But buried beneath that myth, in the silence of libraries and the geometry of sacred places, the knowledge they had shared waited. It never vanished. It only slept. Time has a way of eroding certainty, but it also preserves fragments in unexpected places. The flood had swept away temples, but it could not wash away the patterns carved into stone or the laws embedded in rhythm and measure. The knowledge of the Anunnaki, the art of balance, the science of alignment, the understanding of the world as a system of repeating cycles, continued quietly through the hands of builders, astronomers, healers, and storytellers. They no longer spoke of it as divine. It had become practice, habit, intuition. The gods had been replaced by craftsmen, and the sacred by the measurable. Yet in their work the same wisdom lived on. You can trace its return like the slow re-emergence of land from a receding tide. In Sumer, the first astronomers began to plot the wandering paths of the planets, calling them the writing of the gods. In Egypt, the priests of Heliopolis measured the rising of the star Sirius with astonishing precision, predicting the annual flood of the Nile, a cycle that mirrored the Great Flood itself in miniature. In the Indus Valley, city planners used standardized measures of length and weight, guided by invisible principles of proportion that had no precedent in their own history. Everywhere, the same quiet rediscovery was unfolding. The sense that the universe could be understood, that its motions followed laws both visible and hidden. The knowledge that returned was not always recognized for what it was. It surfaced in fragments, in symbols, in ratios, in rituals whose original meanings were long forgotten. A temple built to honor a god might secretly encode astronomical data. A myth about the journey of the sun through the underworld might preserve information about planetary orbits. A hymn to the goddess of love might be a calendar in disguise, marking the cycle of Venus across the sky. The people who recited these things believed they were worshipping. In truth, they were remembering. In Babylon, centuries after the last Sumerian kings had vanished, a new order of scholars emerged. The Chaldeans, guardians of the heavens. They recorded eclipses, mapped the movements of stars, and established mathematical systems that would influence every civilization that followed. They believed they were discovering new truths, but the equations they used were echoes of those found in the earliest tablets of Sumer, the same base 60, the same celestial logic. They had inherited the rhythm of the old gods without realizing it. The knowledge had never truly been lost. It had only changed its form. The same pattern appeared again in Egypt during the reign of the Old Kingdom's last astronomer priests. Their temples, aligned to solstices and equinoxes, became calendars in stone. Their rituals, timed to the cycles of the stars, preserved the ancient understanding that life on Earth followed celestial laws. The hieroglyphic word for order, ma'at, was not merely moral but cosmic. To live in truth meant to live in balance with the universe. That belief was not born in Egypt. It was older than Egypt. It was the voice of the forgotten age speaking again through new tongues. Across the Mediterranean, the Greeks absorbed the same wisdom and called it philosophy. Pythagoras taught that number was the essence of all things, that harmony in music and geometry reflected the harmony of the heavens. Plato wrote of a perfect world that existed beyond perception, a realm of pure forms that governed the material world below. To them, the universe was not chaos but architecture. They rediscovered what the Anunnaki had once taught, that reality was structured, measurable, and divine in its precision. They gave new language to ancient truths, clothing the sacred in reason. The old gods had become ideas, but the ideas were the same. In the East, the same current moved beneath other names. The sages of India spoke of the Rita, the cosmic order, and of Dharma, the human duty to live in accordance with it. The Chinese philosophers wrote of the Tao, the way through which all things move, and the harmony of yin and yang. These were not borrowings from Sumer, but independent remembrances of the same pattern. The sense that creation is governed by balance, that knowledge and morality are reflections of the same underlying law. The forgotten wisdom of the gods had become the philosophy of humanity. Even the sciences that emerged much later carried traces of it. The study of the heavens became astronomy, the study of the elements became chemistry, and the understanding of number became mathematics. The temples of old had measured the stars to honour the gods. The observatories of later ages measured them to understand the universe. The purpose changed, but the act remained the same. In every observatory and every calculation, there is still a whisper of that ancient devotion, the belief that to know is to align, that comprehension is a form of reverence. What makes the story remarkable is that it never needed to be told aloud. The knowledge returned naturally, as if the world itself remembered. Every time humanity rebuilt, it seemed to arrive at the same conclusions, that the universe has order, that balance sustains life, that the stars are not distant ornaments but part of the same system that governs the tides and the seasons and the human heart. Perhaps that is why the memory of the Anunnaki feels familiar even now. Their teaching was not something external imposed upon the world. It was the articulation of what the world already is. In the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, archaeologists have uncovered tablets filled with what look like technical instructions, lists of numbers, measurements, and star positions so precise that they still align with modern astronomical data. The scribes who copied them could not have known the full implications of what they wrote. They were preserving formulas without context, equations without explanation. And yet, those marks on clay survived 3,000 years of decay and fire and flood, carrying forward fragments of a science too advanced to be fully understood by its inheritors. The forgotten knowledge never returned in one piece. It reappeared like scattered light, refracted through cultures and ages. One civilization would rediscover geometry, another astronomy, another medicine or metallurgy. Each believed itself the pioneer of these revelations. But if you lay their achievements side by side, a pattern emerges. The same ratios, the same alignments, the same understanding that everything, from the orbit of a planet to the rhythm of breath, follows a common order. It is as though the memory of the lost kingdom continues to surface in pieces, guiding humanity along the same paths again and again. And yet, there are moments in history when the return feels deliberate, almost orchestrated. Times when discoveries appear too sudden, too complete, as if unlocked rather than invented. The sudden birth of writing in Sumer, the explosion of geometry in Greece, the flowering of science in the Islamic Golden Age, the Renaissance in Europe, each seems less like innovation and more like reawakening. The same pulse runs through all of them, a collective remembering. Perhaps knowledge, once introduced into the world, can never be destroyed. It simply waits for the right minds to find it again. Some say that the Anunnaki never truly left, that they withdrew into the earth or the heavens, waiting for the time when humanity would be ready to understand what they had given. Others believe they left their knowledge encoded, hidden within the structures they built and the stars they studied. Whether or not those stories are true, the effect is the same. Their presence persists, not in flesh, but in form. Every time we align a structure to the solstice, every time we measure the passage of a shadow, we are reenacting their legacy. In that sense, the forgotten knowledge was never really forgotten. It was absorbed. It became the foundation of human thought. The idea that the world can be known, that it follows laws, that those laws can be expressed in numbers. These are not self-evident truths. They are inheritances. The Sumerians called them me, the divine decrees of civilization. We call them science. The language has changed, but the reverence remains. The search for knowledge is still the search for order, and order is still the quiet echo of the divine. Even now, when we send instruments into space to measure the age of the universe or the structure of matter, we are continuing the work that began in Eridu. Our technology is new, but the impulse behind it is ancient. The same desire to understand the heavens, to restore the connection between what is above and what is below. The forgotten knowledge is not behind us. It is ahead, waiting for us to reach it again. Each discovery we make is a step closer to the memory of what we once knew. Perhaps that is the meaning of the long silence between the gods and humanity. It was not abandonment, it was apprenticeship. The flood was the resetting of the stage, the withdrawal of divine guidance so that humanity could learn to rediscover truth on its own. The return of knowledge is the proof that the lesson succeeded. We have not created understanding from nothing. We have remembered it slowly, painfully, beautifully. In one surviving fragment from the city of Sippar, a late scribe wrote, "The old words have changed their shapes, but their meaning is the same." He could not have known how literal his statement would become. Thousands of years later, we still use the same mathematics, the same calendar based on the same celestial cycles. We still mark our days by the movement of the sun, and our months by the moon. We have renamed the stars, but they still form the same patterns. The continuity is unbroken. The forgotten knowledge is not just the sum of ancient science. It is the understanding that everything is connected, that memory, time, matter, and meaning are part of one system. The Anunnaki did not invent that truth. They revealed it. The king who refused to leave understood that revelation was not a gift, but responsibility. He did not save the world from the flood. He ensured that the memory of the world would return, and it has, again and again, in every civilization that dared to ask how the universe works. If you stand beneath the stars tonight, the same stars that shone over Sumer, over Egypt, over the first builders who measured heaven and earth, you can feel it. The faint awareness that we are not discovering new things but remembering old ones. The constellations have not changed. The rhythm of the planets remains the same. The universe still speaks the language of the order. And we, after so many ages, are finally beginning to understand it again. The forgotten knowledge never vanished. It only waited for us to listen. It hides in mathematics, in architecture, in the quiet logic of nature. It lives in every act of curiosity, every question that begins with wonder. The flood may have ended the age of the gods, but it began the age of remembering, a slow, endless return to the truth that has always been with us. The gods taught it once. Humanity continues the lesson, and as long as we keep asking, the memory will keep answering, one rediscovery at a time. For thousands of years, the story of the gods who came down from the sky remained a myth. It lived in temples and on clay, in hymns and bedtime tales, in symbols carved into stone that no one could read anymore. But time, as it always does, began to turn myth into curiosity. When the old languages were rediscovered and the tablets translated, what had once been divine revelation began to sound strangely technical. The more scholars studied the words, the more the legends of the Anunnaki seemed to blur the line between religion and science, between imagination and record. It was as if the ancients had hidden complex truths inside stories, because that was the only way they could preserve them. The earliest decipherers of cuneiform expected to find prayers and myths, but they also found lists, measurements, and calculations. They discovered that the people who lived 5,000 years ago had already charted the orbits of planets that could barely be seen with the naked eye. They knew of Jupiter and Saturn, called them the Watchers, and traced their slow movement across the heavens with precision that rivaled modern instruments. They understood lunar cycles, solar eclipses, and even the precession of the equinoxes, phenomena thought to have been discovered only thousands of years later. To the ancient Sumerians, this was not mystical. It was practical. The heavens were not symbols, they were schedules. The gods ruled through mathematics. The word me that appears throughout the tablets is often translated as divine law, but its meaning is deeper. It describes principles, formulas, functions, patterns of reality. The gods possessed the me, and through them, the universe maintained balance. In modern language, we might call them natural laws. The myths say, the me governed everything. Agriculture, fertility, kingship, music, even the patterns of speech. Each was a fragment of a greater order, a coded structure that kept existence coherent. It was not faith that preserved the world, but knowledge. The Anunnaki were not beings of thunder and flame, but keepers of that knowledge. They ruled not by force, but by understanding. When archaeologists began to examine the layout of ancient cities, they noticed something uncanny. The placement of temples, canals, and streets seemed to follow precise geometric ratios. The central ziggurat of Uruk, for example, was built on a base that matches a perfect right triangle, its angles aligning exactly with the cardinal directions. The same geometry appears in Egyptian pyramids, in Mayan temples, in the city grids of the Indus Valley. The structures were separated by oceans and millennia, yet they followed the same mathematical code. Perhaps coincidence, or perhaps an echo of a system older than all of them, a shared inheritance from the age of the first kings, who had been taught by the gods themselves. There is science hidden in the stories too. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for instance, describes a plant that grants renewal of youth, hidden in the depths of the sea. It's a myth of immortality, yes, but also a description of preservation, of something biological, regenerative, unknown but real enough to be imagined. The flood story, recorded on the tablets of Atrahasis and echoed later in the Hebrew Bible, matches the geological record of massive deluges at the end of the last ice age, when melting glaciers flooded entire regions. The wrath of the gods may have been nature itself, an environmental shift so immense that it felt supernatural to those who lived through it. Even the strange numbers in the Sumerian King List, rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years, may conceal a form of calculation, not fantasy. Some researchers suggest those figures represent lunar years or celestial cycles, not human lifetimes. Others think they may describe epochs, periods of stability between cataclysms. The ancients had no separate words for myth and record. To them, time was layered, symbolic, recursive. 1,000 years could mean a pattern repeated 1,000 times. Eternity was not endless duration. It was balance achieved. Modern science has a way of confirming what myths once whispered. The ancients claimed that life was created from clay, shaped by divine hands and given breath. Today, biochemistry tells us that the first complex molecules likely formed in clay-rich tidal pools, where minerals acted as catalysts for the reactions that led to life. The story of creation from clay, once seen as metaphor, might be memory, a poetic recollection of how the world truly began. In the same way, the Sumerians' tales of the gods descending from the heavens could be a reflection of early astronomy, of something observed in the night sky that felt alive. To see the planets moving independently against the backdrop of fixed stars must have seemed like the footsteps of divine beings crossing the heavens. Every generation reinterprets the old stories in its own language. To the ancients, the gods were real. To philosophers, they became principles. To scientists, they became natural laws. The transformation is not dismissal, but translation. When we speak of gravity shaping the cosmos, we are describing what they once called the will of Anu. When we measure the force that binds matter together, we are studying what they called the decrees of Enlil. When we explore the complexity of life, we are following the path that Enki once ruled, the god of water, creation and hidden knowledge. The pantheon has changed its names, but not its nature. Even the concept of the tablets of destiny, the sacred records that gave the gods their authority over the universe, has an eerie resonance in modern science. To hold the tablets was to understand the code of creation. Today we speak of DNA as the blueprint of life, written in 4 symbols controlling every form of existence on Earth. It is a biological tablet of destiny, read and rewritten with the same reverence and danger that the ancients once attributed to divine command. When scientists first cracked the genetic code, it was not so different from the moment when the first scribe pressed his stylus into clay. The revelation that reality is written, and that to read it is to hold power. The Anunnaki's forgotten knowledge may never have been lost at all. It may simply have been rephrased. Their understanding of the heavens, of structure, of rhythm and order, became the architecture of civilization. Their myths, translated into symbols, became the foundation of disciplines that would one day be called astronomy, mathematics, medicine. The story of the king who refused to leave became a parable of persistence, that truth endures beneath the flood of time. There is a strange humility in the way modern discovery keeps circling back to ancient intuition. The more we learn about the cosmos, the more it resembles the systems the ancients imagined. Space is not chaos, it is structure. The universe is not random, it is governed by constants. The particles that form everything obey patterns as strict and elegant as any divine decree. Physics, in its own quiet way, confirms what myth has always suggested, that there is order behind the apparent disorder, that creation is not accident but process. Perhaps that is what the ancients meant by calling the gods those who keep the measures. They were not speaking of rulers in the human sense, but of forces, predictable, precise, eternal. When they built temples to align with solstices or equinoxes, they were not worshipping the sun itself, but the reliability of its path, the law that it never failed. Every ritual, every offering, every song was an act of synchronization, an attempt to bring human life into harmony with cosmic law. In that way, religion and science were never separate. They were 2 languages describing the same thing, and still buried within the stories there is mystery. The Sumerians spoke of Nibiru, the crossing planet, a celestial body that appeared only at long intervals, associated with upheaval and renewal. Astronomers have never confirmed such a planet, though traces of gravitational anomalies at the edge of the solar system continue to raise questions. Whether real or symbolic, Nibiru remains an idea of cyclic return. The same belief that knowledge, like worlds, is never lost, only hidden until it circles back again. Every era rediscovers its own Nibiru, a returning understanding that the world is older, more intricate, and more connected than we thought. The rediscovery of Sumer itself was one such moment. When the first archaeologists uncovered the tablets in the 19th century, they realized they were reading the world's oldest written words. Within those lines were the first equations, the first laws, the first stories of creation and flood. Everything that followed, our mathematics, our philosophy, our faiths, traced their roots to that buried kingdom. The myths had not been exaggerations. They were foundations. It's easy now to separate science from myth, to see one as truth and the other as imagination. But in the beginning, they were the same pursuit. To tell a story about the world was to explain it. To measure it was to honour it. The ancients understood that knowing and believing were not opposites. They were two parts of a single act, to see pattern in the chaos of experience. We have changed the instruments, but not the intention. The astronomer with his telescope, the physicist with her equations, the archaeologist brushing dust from a tablet, all are engaged in the same ancient work, recovering order from silence. Maybe that is the enduring power of the Anunnaki myth, not in its literal details but in its symbolic truth. It reminds us that knowledge itself is sacred, that understanding the world is an act of reverence. The gods of Sumer ruled through comprehension. They brought light not by miracle but by explanation, and though their temples fell and their names were forgotten, the impulse they began has never stopped. The laboratories of today are their new shrines. The equations on our screens are their hymns. The scientists of our age are, without realizing it, continuing the worship of the same invisible order. The science behind the myth is not about proving the gods were real. It's about realizing that the myths were already science, the first attempts to describe what could not yet be measured. To read the tablets of Sumer is to glimpse a mind that saw the world as a living system of cause and effect, of rhythm and symmetry. The gods were symbols of those relationships, personifications of the laws that bind the universe together. In that sense, we are still their students, still reading the same text, only with new tools. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of the Forgotten Age, that knowledge is eternal, but our understanding of it changes form. The Anunnaki built with stone and myth, we build with circuits and light, but the purpose is the same, to find meaning in the structure of existence, to look upward and know that what we see is not random but written. The ancients spoke of tablets, we speak of data. They spoke of destiny, we speak of design. Both mean the same thing, that the universe is intelligible and that intelligence itself is a bridge to the divine. The myth remains not as superstition, but as memory. Every equation, every discovery, every revelation is an echo of that first moment when the king of Eridu looked at the stars and saw law instead of chaos. That was the beginning of science. That was the birth of wonder, and we, still reaching upward, are only continuing what began beneath the ancient Mesopotamian sky. The myth has not ended. It has become reality. The gods no longer walk beside us, but their language surrounds us, written not in cuneiform, but in atoms, in gravity, in light. The story that began with the descent of kingship from heaven continues in every act of discovery, in every attempt to understand why the world is the way it is. The Anunnaki may be gone, but their science, their order, their balance, their curiosity, still shapes the human mind. And so, the myth returns as knowledge, the knowledge returns as reverence, and the reverence becomes the quiet realization that we are, after all, the continuation of the same story. The heirs of the forgotten gods, still decoding the tablets of the sky. Even when civilizations crumble, memory does not die easily. It lingers in corners of language, in customs that no one remembers the reasons for, in measurements and myths and habits that have survived every flood, every empire, every silence. The story of the Anunnaki and their king, the story of how knowledge descended from the heavens and was nearly lost, still moves quietly beneath the world we live in. You can feel it in the names of stars, in the geometry of buildings, in the rhythm of calendars. The age of gods has passed, but their memory continues to breathe through us, hidden in plain sight. Every culture that followed Sumer's fall became a custodian of fragments. The Babylonians preserved the star charts. The Egyptians kept the alignment of temples. The Greeks carried the logic of number. The Hebrews remembered the flood. The Persians, the Hindus, the Mayans, the Chinese, each carried a spark, a piece of the same forgotten fire. and though they spoke in different tongues and worshipped under different skies, the structure of their thought remained the same. The world is ordered, and memory is sacred. In every generation, that conviction has survived, passed from teacher to pupil, from stone to paper, from paper to code. The memory changes shape, but it never disappears. When writing faded, oral stories kept it alive. When the stories faded, ruins spoke for it. When ruins fell silent, symbols carried it forward in architecture, ritual, and art. Even today we continue the same inheritance without realizing it. The 7 days of the week mirror the 7 heavenly bodies known to the ancients: Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, Saturn. The same 7 gods that ruled Sumer's cosmos. The hours of the day, the degrees of the circle, the seconds ticking away on a clock all descend from the Sumerian base 60 system. Every time we measure, calculate, divide, we speak the language of those first scribes, long dead yet still shaping our perception of time and space. It is strange how something so old can feel so intimate. We live in a world they could not have imagined, filled with machines and light and knowledge that stretches to the edges of the universe, yet the foundations beneath it are theirs. The patterns they set have never been broken, only refined. When we send a probe to another planet, it travels along a path plotted by the same geometry that guided the priests of Eridu when they aligned their temples to the stars. When we split an atom, we are acting out the same curiosity that made them look upward and ask what holds the world together. The memory of their order is not just historical, it is biological. It moves in our hands, in our minds, in the quiet logic that makes us human. There are places where that memory feels stronger, where the past seems to resist oblivion. In the ruins of when the sun sets and the shadows lengthen across the ziggurat steps, the air itself seems to hum. The wind carries the faint scent of baked clay and ancient fires. The desert is silent, yet the silence feels inhabited. Archaeologists describe the experience of standing there at night as unsettling, as though the place is still aware of itself. Beneath the ground lie millions of fragments, tablets, tools, bones, each a small piece of the same long conversation. The city is gone, but its thoughts remain, pressed into the soil like seeds. And beyond those ruins, in the languages we still speak, the traces continue. Words like Anki, Ilu, El, Ra, Baal, Amen, the ancient syllables of gods and places, echo through Hebrew, Arabic, Greek, Latin. The sounds themselves have survived the fall of temples and empires. They flow through scripture, song and story, connecting modern prayers to prehistoric hymns. When people speak of heaven and earth, of creation and fall, of order and chaos, they are unknowingly repeating the vocabulary of Sumer, the grammar of the world's first attempt to make sense of the infinite. Memory does not need belief to endure. It survives through repetition. Every act of building, every calculation, every retelling strengthens its pulse. The Anunnaki have become myth, the king a legend, yet their message, that knowledge is sacred and order must be maintained, has outlasted their names. Even those who dismiss the stories still live within their consequences. Our laws follow their logic. Our calendars trace their rhythms. Our science fulfills their prophecy. We remember without knowing that we remember. The persistence of that memory is not accidental. It was designed. The last king understood that words could be destroyed, but patterns could not. Before the flood came, he ordered his scribes to encode their understanding into shapes and ratios, to build knowledge into the world itself. The proportions of sacred spaces, the angles of monuments, the base numbers of their calculations, all were deliberate, chosen because they could survive translation. He knew languages would vanish, but geometry would not. Stone would crack, but proportion would endure. And so it did. The architecture of thought became the architecture of civilization. Even when the last temple collapsed, its echoes lingered in imitation. The cathedrals of medieval Europe rose from the same blueprint as the ziggurats, their spires reaching upward to reconnect heaven and earth. The domes of the Islamic world mirrored the vault of the sky, carrying forward the same reverence for the cosmic order. The pyramids of Mesoamerica aligned with the same celestial markers as those of Egypt and Sumer, continuing a tradition so old that no one remembered its origin. Each age believed it was creating something new, but in truth it was completing a circuit, restoring a pattern too ancient to fade. The rediscovery of that pattern in modern times is what we call archaeology, but beneath the science of excavation lies something more personal, the sensation of touching memory itself. When a researcher brushes dust from a tablet after 4,000 years of silence, what returns is not just data, but consciousness. The thoughts of a human mind, preserved in clay, cross the gulf of time and speak again. That act, reading, understanding, continuing, is the closest thing to resurrection that civilization has ever achieved. The dead speak through knowledge. The world remembers through those who listen. In that sense, the memory of the Anunnaki is not confined to myth or text. It lives in the continuity of inquiry. The scientists who map galaxies are heirs to the same tradition as the scribes who mapped stars. The engineers who design machines that measure the invisible are continuing the same devotion that once aligned temples to solstices. The philosophers who search for meaning in pattern are the descendants of the priests who sang the hymns of creation. The roles have changed, but the impulse is identical: to understand, to preserve, to remember. There is a quiet beauty in how evenly the past has distributed itself through the present. Every civilization, knowingly or not, has guarded a piece of the memory, as if humanity itself were the vessel chosen to keep it alive. The flood might have washed away the divine, but it also made us its inheritors. The king who stayed behind ensured that his people would become the world's archive, their curiosity the last living shrine, and from that inheritance came everything that defines us: writing, art, measurement, reason, hope. Memory became our purpose. Sometimes it returns to us suddenly, like the resurfacing of a dream, a discovery, a translation, an invention. Each feels new but carries the weight of recognition, as if the world were reminding itself of something it once knew. When the first telescope revealed moons circling distant planets, the astronomers who looked through it felt awe, but also familiarity. The heavens were not strangers. They were old companions seen again. When the atom was split and the hidden forces of nature revealed, humanity felt both triumph and terror, the same emotions the myths describe when the gods first gave fire to men. We have never escaped those patterns, we only reinterpret them. In the quiet hours of night, when lights are low and the noise of the world fades, the continuity becomes clearer. The stars move across the sky in their old paths. The constellations of Sumer still rise above the same deserts. The moon still governs the tides. The earth still turns with the same patient rhythm it had when the first temple was built. We may have changed, but the universe has not. It continues to echo the same truth, that nothing is ever truly lost. Perhaps that is why the myth endures, not because it is literal, but because it describes something deeper than history. The memory that refuses to die is not about gods descending from the sky. It is about the permanence of curiosity, the resilience of thought, the persistence of the desire to understand. The Anunnaki gave the world more than civilization. They gave it continuity, the ability to rebuild after every flood, to rediscover after every forgetting, to rise again after every fall. Humanity, in its endless rebuilding, is their monument. The king who refused to leave must have known that. Standing among the ruins of his drowned world, he understood that he could not save his people from mortality, but he could save their purpose. He ensured that knowledge would outlive destruction, that memory would become the foundation of every world to come, and so it did. Through millennia of loss, war, and rebirth, that memory continues to surface. Quiet, resilient, unstoppable. Even now, we feel it. In every museum, in every laboratory, in every classroom where someone asks why, the same ancient pulse beats. The king's promise fulfilled itself. The world remembers. The gods are gone, but their memory has become the mind of humanity. The flood ended one form of existence and began another. What survived was not the immortality of flesh, but the immortality of thought. If you listen carefully, in silence, you can almost hear it. The soft murmur beneath the noise of the modern world, the low hum of continuity that connects everything living to everything that has ever lived. It is not sound but rhythm, not voice but presence. The same presence that filled the temples of Sumer now fills the spaces between stars, the circuits of machines, the thoughts of those who continue to seek. It is the memory of the first civilization, the first question, the first understanding that knowledge itself is divine. The memory refuses to die because it is not a memory of events but of purpose. It is woven into the pattern of existence. It survives not in ruins or records but in repetition, in every act of creation, in every pursuit of truth. As long as someone looks at the night sky and feels the same wonder the ancients felt, the story continues. As long as hands reach to build, to write, to measure, the lineage of the Anunnaki endures. The flood was only water, time is only change, but memory, that invisible architecture of continuity, transcends both. The king's world is gone, but his echo remains in every thought that seeks to bridge heaven and earth. That is why the story never truly ends. It only changes form, surviving through us, waiting for the next age to remember again. And perhaps that is all eternity really means. Not unending life, but unending remembrance. The gods may have written the first lines, but humanity has kept the script alive, one generation at a time. The clay may crumble, the stars may shift, but the memory endures, not as legend, not as history, but as the quiet truth that connects all time. The world remembers. It always will.